Tonight, you'll discover an ancient wisdom that Buddhist monks have treasured for over 2,500 years. The profound art of releasing mental burdens and finding true inner stillness. I'm going to share 12 transformative Buddhist stories that have guided countless monks through the darkest nights of worry and into the most peaceful rest of their lives. Each story contains a timeless teaching that unlocks your mind's natural ability to set down the weight of daily concerns and drift into profound tranquility. And here's what makes this different from ordinary relaxation techniques. These ancient teachings work even if you've never stepped foot in a monastery. Even if your mind feels like it's spinning endlessly. Even if you've tried countless methods without success. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." In the next 3 hours, you'll discover exactly how Buddhist monks have applied this truth for centuries, finding rest not by fighting their thoughts, but by understanding them completely. As we journey through tales of patient gardeners, silent bells, and unexpected teachers, you'll notice something remarkable beginning to unfold. Your breathing will naturally deepen, the tension in your shoulders will start to melt away, and you'll find yourself settling into the same profound stillness that has restored countless monks throughout history. So, make yourself comfortable. Feel the softness of your pillow supporting your head. Allow your body to become heavy and relaxed against whatever surface supports you now. Take one slow, deep breath with me, and as you exhale, know that you've just begun a journey into the heart of Buddhist wisdom, a path that has been waiting to embrace you since the very beginning. Let's begin with our first story. In a peaceful monastery nestled high in the mountains of Tibet, there lived an elderly monk named Tenzin, who tended the most beautiful garden anyone had ever seen. His vegetables grew in perfect rows, his flowers bloomed in harmonious colors, and even the stones seemed to rest exactly where they belonged. Visitors from distant lands would journey for months just to witness the serenity of his garden. One spring, a young monk named Lobsang arrived at the monastery, carrying with him years of study in Buddhist philosophy and an eager desire to achieve enlightenment quickly. He had memorized countless sutras, practiced meditation with intensity, and debated the finer points of Dharma with scholars across the region. Yet despite all his learning, peace seemed to elude him like water slipping through his fingers. When Lobsang first saw Master Tenzin's garden, he was immediately struck by its perfection. "Master," he said, bowing deeply, "I have studied the teachings extensively, but I cannot seem to find the inner peace that clearly dwells within you. Please, will you accept me as your student and teach me the secret of your tranquil mind?" The old monk looked up from where he was gently placing seeds into small holes in the earth. His weathered hands were covered in soil, and his simple robes bore the stains of honest work. "If you wish to study with me," he said with a gentle smile, "then you must learn to tend a garden. Choose a plot of ground behind the meditation hall and begin." Lobsang was puzzled. He had expected profound philosophical discussions, complex meditation techniques, perhaps esoteric teachings passed down through generations of masters. "But Master," he protested, "I have come to study enlightenment, not agriculture. How can digging in dirt lead to awakening?" "Begin with the garden," Tenzin repeated kindly. "Understanding grows like a plant, slowly, naturally, in its own season." Reluctantly, Lobsang selected a patch of overgrown ground and set to work. Having spent his years with books rather than tools, he found the physical labor exhausting. His back ached, his hands blistered, and progress seemed impossibly slow. Each day he would look over at Master Tenzin's perfect garden and feel frustrated with his own messy plot, where weeds seemed to sprout faster than his carefully planted vegetables. After 2 weeks of struggling, Lobsang approached his teacher in frustration. "Master, my garden is a disaster. The plants grow crooked, weeds overrun everything I plant, and nothing looks like it should. I must be doing something terribly wrong." Master Tenzin set down his watering pot and walked over to examine Lobsang's plot. What he saw was indeed chaotic. Some plants too crowded together, others struggling in poor soil, weeds scattered throughout. But his eyes were gentle as he observed the young monk's work. "Tell me," the master asked, "when you planted these seeds, what did you expect to happen?" "I expected them to grow properly, to look like yours," Lobsang replied. "And how quickly did you expect this to happen?" "Well, I suppose I hoped to see results within a few days." The old monk nodded knowingly. "Come, sit with me for a moment." They settled on a simple wooden bench overlooking both gardens. "When I plant a seed," Tenzin continued, "I do not expect it to become a full plant overnight. I do not grow angry with the soil for being slow or frustrated with the rain for not coming exactly when I think it should. I plant, I water, I tend with care, and I wait with patience." He gestured toward his thriving garden. "This beauty you see has taken 30 years to develop. Each season taught me something new. Some years, drought destroyed half my crops. Other years, floods washed away months of work. I learned not to fight these natural cycles, but to work with them." Lobsang listened intently as his teacher continued. "Your mind, young monk, is exactly like this garden. You have been trying to force immediate perfection, growing frustrated when your thoughts don't behave as you think they should. But the mind, like soil, must be prepared slowly. Weeds of worry and anxiety must be gently removed, not violently uprooted, and the seeds of peace must be given time to take root." Over the following months, Lobsang began to understand his teacher's wisdom. He learned to approach his garden work with patience rather than urgency. When weeds appeared, he removed them calmly without frustration. When plants grew slowly, he watered them consistently without demanding faster results. Gradually, his plot began to show signs of real life and order. More importantly, he noticed that his approach to meditation was changing as well. Instead of fighting his wandering thoughts like weeds to be violently torn out, he began to gently redirect his attention back to his breath, the same way he would gently guide a young plant toward the sunlight. When difficult emotions arose during his sitting practice, he learned to tend to them with the same patience he showed his struggling seedlings. One morning in late autumn, as the harvest season was ending, Master Tenzin found Lobsang sitting quietly in his now flourishing garden. The young monk was perfectly still, his face serene, watching the morning light filter through the leaves of a small tree he had planted months earlier. "Master," Lobsang said softly without opening his eyes, "I think I'm beginning to understand. The garden was never about vegetables, was it?" The old monk smiled, recognizing in his student's voice the same peaceful quality that comes when inner soil has been properly prepared. "What have you learned, my young friend?" "I've learned that peace cannot be forced or rushed. It grows naturally when we tend to the conditions that support it. Patience instead of urgency, gentle persistence instead of violent effort, acceptance of natural timing instead of demanding immediate results. The garden taught me how to treat my own mind with the same care and wisdom." Master Tenzin nodded with deep satisfaction. "And what else?" "I've learned that there is no such thing as failure in a garden, only lessons. Every withered plant taught me something about soil or watering or timing. Every season that didn't produce what I expected still produced understanding. My mind works the same way. Every difficult meditation, every day when peace seemed impossible, was actually teaching me something valuable. The old monk placed a gentle hand on his student's shoulder. You have indeed learned the secret of the garden. Now you can tend your inner landscape with the same wisdom for the rest of your life. The Buddha taught, patience is the supreme virtue. This simple truth lies at the heart of Master Tenzin's garden wisdom. In our fast-paced world, we often approach our spiritual development the same way Lobsang initially approached his garden, with impatience, demanding immediate results, growing frustrated when our minds don't transform as quickly as we think they should. Why do we struggle so intensely with the natural timing of inner growth? Buddhist psychology points to several deeply ingrained patterns in our thinking. First is our addiction to immediate gratification, the modern mind's expectation that all problems should have quick solutions. We live in a culture where we can instantly access information, communicate across the globe in seconds, and satisfy most desires with rapid delivery. This conditioning makes it particularly challenging to engage with the slow, organic process of spiritual development. Second is our tendency toward self-judgment, the harsh inner voice that declares us failures when we don't meet our own unrealistic expectations. Like Lobsang criticizing his chaotic garden plot, we often berate ourselves for having wandering thoughts during meditation, for feeling anxious after months of practice, or for not achieving the serene composure we imagine enlightened people possess. Third is our misunderstanding of what spiritual practice actually involves. Many of us begin meditation or Buddhist study expecting it to eliminate difficult thoughts and emotions permanently. But as Master Tenzin demonstrated, even the most beautiful garden requires ongoing tending. Weeds will continue to sprout, seasons will bring different challenges, and the gardener's work is never truly finished. The garden metaphor reveals something profound about the nature of mental cultivation. Just as a garden requires different care in different seasons, our inner landscape needs varied approaches depending on what we're experiencing. During the spring seasons of our lives, when we're full of energy and new ideas, we might focus on planting new seeds of wisdom through study and learning. During summer seasons, when life feels abundant but also overwhelming, we might concentrate on maintaining what we've grown, watering our practice consistently even when we don't feel like it. Autumn seasons of our lives often bring the harvest of understanding, when insights we've been cultivating for months or years suddenly ripen into genuine wisdom. And winter seasons, though they may feel barren and difficult, are actually when the deepest root growth happens, when our practice develops the strong foundation that will support future flourishing. Buddhist monks have long understood that enlightenment is not a destination to reach, but a way of tending to each moment with awareness and compassion. When we approach our spiritual development like Master Tenzin approached his garden, with patient consistency, gentle persistence, and acceptance of natural timing, we create the conditions where genuine peace can take root and flourish. Tonight, as you rest in the quietness of this moment, can you bring the same gentle patience to your own inner landscape that a wise gardener brings to their plot? Can you tend to your thoughts and emotions with the understanding that growth happens slowly, naturally, in its own perfect season? Remember the Buddha's words, "A disciplined mind brings happiness." This discipline is not harsh or forced, but patient and kind, like the steady care of a gardener who knows that with proper tending, even the most chaotic plot can become a place of extraordinary beauty and peace. Deep in the forests of ancient China stood a monastery famous not for its grand buildings or wealthy patrons, but for a single bronze bell that had not rung for over 100 years. Monks from distant provinces would journey for weeks to experience what they called the teaching of the silent bell, though visitors often left more puzzled than enlightened. The monastery was home to Master Wei, an elderly monk whose profound stillness seemed to emanate peace like warmth from a gentle fire. Under his guidance lived a community of 30 monks who had learned to find their teaching not in lengthy discourses or complex philosophical debates, but in the quality of presence they brought to each ordinary moment. One autumn morning, a young scholar named Chen arrived at the monastery gates. He was widely recognized for his brilliant mind and eloquent speech, having won debates with learned masters throughout the region. Chen had come seeking an intellectual challenge, hoping to engage Master Wei in the kind of sophisticated Dharma discussion that would enhance his already considerable reputation. When Chen was led into the meditation hall, he immediately noticed the large bronze bell hanging motionless in the center of the room. Its surface was covered with intricate carvings of dragons and lotus flowers, and even in silence, it seemed to command attention. "Master Wei," Chen began after offering appropriate bows, "I have traveled far to discuss the deeper meanings of Buddhist philosophy with you. I am particularly interested in your understanding of the doctrine of emptiness and how it relates to the cultivation of wisdom." The elderly monk acknowledged Chen's words with a gentle nod, but did not immediately respond. Instead, he gestured toward cushions arranged in a circle around the silent bell. "Please, sit with us for our morning meditation." Chen was somewhat disappointed. He had not come for simple meditation, but for intellectual discourse. Nevertheless, he took his place among the other monks and attempted to settle into stillness. But his mind was busy preparing the sophisticated questions he would ask after this preliminary sitting period ended. As the meditation continued, Chen found himself increasingly agitated by the complete silence in the hall. He was accustomed to discussions, debates, the stimulating exchange of ideas. This wordless sitting felt like a waste of his valuable time. After what seemed like hours, though it was actually only 30 minutes. The sitting period ended with a subtle hand signal from Master Wei. "Now," Chen said eagerly, "perhaps we could explore the relationship between consciousness and phenomena as described in the Yogacara teachings." Master Wei looked at the young scholar with eyes that held no judgment, only gentle curiosity. "Tell me," he said softly, "what did you hear during our meditation?" Chen was puzzled by the question. "Well, nothing really. That's rather the point of this old bell, isn't it? Everyone says it doesn't ring anymore." "Nothing at all?" the master inquired. Chen thought for a moment. "I suppose there was the sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside, and occasionally a bird calling in the distance. Once I heard what might have been someone walking on the gravel path near the kitchen," said Master Wei. "And what did these sounds teach you?" This question struck Chen as rather simple. "They didn't teach me anything, Master. They were just random noises, distractions from the real purpose of meditation." The old monk nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And what do you believe is the real purpose of meditation? To achieve states of deep concentration, to realize profound truths about the nature of reality, to develop the kind of insight that leads to enlightenment," Chen replied with confidence. Master Wei gestured toward the silent bell. "This bell has been my teacher for 40 years. Would you like to know what it has taught me?" Finally, Chen thought they would get to the heart of some esoteric teaching. "Yes, Master. Please share its wisdom. It has taught me, the old monk said, that the most profound truths cannot be spoken. Chen frowned. But surely you don't mean that literally. The Buddha himself gave countless teachings, and generations of masters have transmitted the Dharma through words and concepts. Indeed, they have. Master Wei agreed. Words can point toward truth, like a finger pointing at the moon. But tell me, when you look at a finger pointing at the moon, what are you actually seeing? The finger, of course, but the finger is indicating the moon, precisely. And if you become fascinated with the finger, its shape, its color, the way it moves, what happens to your awareness of the moon? Chen began to see where this was leading, but he wasn't entirely convinced. Are you suggesting that intellectual understanding is somehow inferior to what? Simple silence. Master Wei smiled. Not inferior, just different. Both words and silence have their place. But many of us become so skilled with words that we forget how to listen to what lies beneath them. He gestured again toward the bell. This bell was once used to call the community to meals, to mark the hours of prayer, to announce important ceremonies. It served its purpose well. But one day, many decades before I arrived here, it simply stopped ringing. The monks could find nothing wrong with it, no cracks in the bronze, no problems with the wooden striker. It had simply entered a different kind of service. What kind of service? Chen asked, his curiosity genuinely awakened now. The service of teaching through presence rather than announcement. You see, when this bell was ringing regularly, people would hear it and think, time for the meal, or the evening prayers are beginning. Their attention would immediately move toward whatever activity the bell was announcing. But now, when people sit with this silent bell, something very different happens. Master Wei paused, allowing the silence to deepen around them before continuing. Now, people find themselves listening more carefully to everything. The absence of the expected sound makes them more aware of all the sounds that are actually present. The silence becomes a doorway into a deeper kind of hearing. Over the following days, Chen found himself drawn to spend time in the meditation hall, sitting with the silent bell. At first, his scholarly mind kept trying to analyze what he was supposed to be learning. But gradually, something began to shift. He noticed that in the profound quiet surrounding the bell, his ability to perceive subtle sounds became remarkably acute. The whisper of his own breathing, the soft settling sounds of the wooden building, the distant chanting from other parts of the monastery, all of these became vividly present. More significantly, he began to notice the quality of silence between his own thoughts. In his normal life, Chen's mind moved rapidly from concept to concept, analysis to analysis, always engaged with mental content. But sitting with the silent bell, he discovered spaces of pure awareness that were not filled with thinking, spaces that felt remarkably peaceful and alive. On his final morning at the monastery, Chen sat once more in the meditation hall. As the period of sitting came to an end, he found himself reluctant to leave the profound stillness that surrounded the silent bell. "Master Wei," he said as they walked together toward the monastery gates, "I think I'm beginning to understand what the bell has been teaching. It's not that words and concepts are wrong, but that they're not the deepest level of communication, are they?" The old monk nodded. "What have you discovered?" "I've discovered that beneath all our talking and thinking and analyzing, there's a quality of awareness that doesn't need words to understand. It's like the bell is always ringing, but on a frequency that can only be heard in silence." Master Wei stopped walking and turned to face his young visitor. And how will you carry this teaching back to your life in the world? Chen considered this carefully. I think I'll try to listen more and speak less. Not because speaking is bad, but because I want to make sure I'm speaking from that deeper place of understanding, not just from my clever mind. As Chen departed, Master Wei remained standing at the monastery gates long after the young scholar had disappeared down the mountain path. The afternoon light was filtering through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing its simple song into the vast silence of the mountains. The Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Master Wei's silent bell embodies this profound truth, demonstrating that the most important communication often happens not through speaking, but through the quality of presence we bring to each moment. Why do we struggle so deeply with silence in our modern world? Buddhist understanding points to several patterns that keep us trapped in what monks call the realm of words and concepts. First is our cultural conditioning that equates knowledge with the ability to articulate complex ideas. From early education through professional life, we're rewarded for verbal and analytical skills, often at the expense of developing our capacity for direct, non-conceptual awareness. Second is our fear of emptiness, the deep anxiety many people feel when confronted with silence or stillness. Our minds have become so accustomed to constant mental stimulation that silence can initially feel uncomfortable or even frightening. We fill every quiet moment with music, conversation, thinking, or digital distractions, rarely allowing ourselves to experience the profound peace that naturally arises in undisturbed stillness. Third is our misunderstanding of what communication actually involves. We often confuse information transfer with genuine understanding. Chen arrived at the monastery believing that wisdom came through the exchange of sophisticated concepts, but the silent bell taught him that the deepest understanding happens in a realm that transcends conceptual thinking entirely. The silent bell represents what Zen masters call direct transmission beyond words and letters. This doesn't mean that words are useless. The Buddha himself taught for years using language to point toward truth. But it recognizes that the ultimate reality these words point toward can only be directly experienced, never fully captured in concepts or descriptions. In Buddhist monasteries, periods of noble silence are considered essential for spiritual development. During these times, monks communicate only when absolutely necessary, creating space for a different quality of awareness to emerge. In this silence, they often discover that they can sense each other's mental and emotional states with remarkable clarity, communicating through presence and energy rather than words. The teaching of the silent bell applies powerfully to our daily lives. How often do we rush to fill awkward silences in conversations, missing opportunities for deeper connection? How frequently do we listen to others while simultaneously preparing our response, rather than receiving their communication with full attention? How many times do we mistake having opinions about something for actually understanding it? Buddhist monks cultivate what they call listening with the whole being, a quality of receptivity that hears not just the words someone speaks, but the feelings, intentions, and deeper truths that lie beneath their expression. This kind of listening is impossible when our minds are busy formulating responses or judgments. It requires the same quality of open silence that surrounds the monastery bell. In meditation practice, many students initially struggle with the absence of mental content, expecting their practice to be filled with profound insights or special experiences. But like Chen learning to sit with the silent bell, we gradually discover that the most profound teachings emerge not from the presence of special thoughts, but from the fertile emptiness between thoughts. Tonight, as you rest in the growing quiet of this moment, can you allow yourself to experience the teaching of your own inner silent bell? Can you notice the spaces between your thoughts, the quality of awareness that exists beneath the constant commentary of the thinking mind? Remember the Buddha's words, silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind. In learning to be comfortable with silence, both outer and inner, we create the conditions where genuine wisdom can naturally arise, teaching us truths that no amount of words could ever convey. In the bustling city of Varanasi, during the time when the Buddha walked the earth, there lived a wealthy merchant named Ananda, who had built a prosperous trading business through years of careful planning and hard work. His warehouses were filled with silk, spices, and precious metals, and his caravans traveled trade routes that stretched from the mountains of Tibet to the ports of southern India. Yet, despite his material success, Ananda found himself consumed by constant worry. Each night, as he lay on his comfortable bed surrounded by the finest luxuries, his mind would race with anxious thoughts. What if bandits attacked his next caravan? What if the monsoon rains damaged his stored goods? What if political unrest disrupted his trade routes? What if his competitors undercut his prices? These worries followed him everywhere. During meals, he would taste nothing because his mind was busy calculating potential losses. While walking through his beautiful gardens, he would see only the withering leaves and ignore the blooming flowers. Even during religious ceremonies, when others found peace in prayer and ritual, Ananda's thoughts would drift to his business concerns. One morning, as he was preparing for an important trading expedition to the northern kingdoms, Ananda encountered a group of Buddhist monks collecting alms in the marketplace. Among them was an elderly monk whose face radiated such peaceful contentment that the merchant found himself strangely drawn to approach him. "Venerable sir," Ananda said, offering rice and coins to the monk's begging bowl, "I have a question that troubles me deeply. I have been blessed with great wealth and success, yet I find no peace in my achievements. My mind is constantly agitated with worries about the future. How is it that you, who own nothing but a bowl and robes, appear so content?" The old monk looked at Ananda with eyes full of compassion. "Kind merchant, tell me about your upcoming journey to the north." Ananda was surprised by this question, but answered readily, "I am taking 50 ox carts, loaded with valuable goods, along the mountain passes. The journey will take 2 months, and I hope to trade these goods for precious stones and rare herbs that will bring great profit when I return to Varanasi." "And what provisions will you take for this journey?" the monk inquired. "Well, naturally I will take enough food and water for the entire expedition. I have calculated precisely how much grain, oil, and dried fruit will be needed for my men and animals for the full 60 days of travel." The monk nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And will you also pack food and water for your return journey?" "Of course," Ananda replied. "I must carry sufficient provisions for the entire round trip." "Ah," said the monk with a gentle smile. "And what about the journey you plan to take next year? Will you load those provisions onto your carts as well?" Ananda looked puzzled. "That would be absurd. How could I possibly carry supplies for a journey I haven't even planned yet? My oxen would collapse under the weight, and I would never reach my destination." "Indeed," the monk agreed. "And what about provisions for the journey you might take the year after that? Or 5 years from now?" Venerable Sir Ananda protested. "Surely you can see that such a thing would be impossible. No merchant could succeed while carrying provisions for every possible future journey. He would be so weighed down that he could never complete even his current travels. The old monk's eyes sparkled with gentle wisdom. Yet this is exactly what you do with your mind, dear merchant. You carry not only the natural concerns of your current business, but also the worries of countless future possibilities that may never come to pass. Your mind staggers under the weight of imaginary problems, just as your oxen would collapse under the burden of unnecessary provisions. Ananda fell silent, struck by the accuracy of this observation. The monk continued, "When you begin your journey north, you will take exactly what you need for that specific expedition. No more, no less. This is wisdom. But your mind carries worries about business ventures you haven't undertaken, problems that don't exist, and disasters that exist only in your imagination." But surely, Ananda argued, a wise merchant must plan for contingencies and anticipate potential difficulties. Planning and worrying are entirely different activities, the monk replied. A skilled merchant plans for reasonable possibilities and takes sensible precautions. But worry means carrying the emotional weight of problems that don't exist in this moment. It means suffering today for difficulties that may never materialize. The monk gestured toward Ananda's loaded carts waiting nearby. "Tell me, when you planned this expedition, did you make practical preparations for possible delays, bad weather, or route changes?" "Yes, certainly. I chose reliable drivers, selected sturdy oxen, packed extra supplies for unexpected delays, and planned alternative routes in case our primary path becomes impassable." "Excellent. That is wise preparation. But do you lie awake at night rehearsing conversations with bandits you may never meet? Do you spend your days imagining specific scenarios of every possible disaster?" Ananda recognized himself in this description and felt somewhat embarrassed. "Yes, I often find myself doing exactly that. This is the difference," the monk explained gently, "between wise preparation and useless worry. Preparation serves your actual journey. Worry serves only your imagination's endless capacity for creating suffering." Over the following days, as Ananda prepared for his departure, he began to observe his mental habits with new awareness. He noticed how often his mind would leap forward to problems that existed only as possibilities, carrying the full emotional weight of these imaginary difficulties as if they were already real. Gradually, he began to experiment with the monk's teaching. When he found himself worrying about potential bandits, he would ask, "Have I taken reasonable precautions against this possibility?" If the answer was yes, he would consciously redirect his attention to present moment tasks. If the answer was no, he would take appropriate action and then return his focus to the current day's work. The transformation was remarkable. As Ananda learned to distinguish between practical planning and useless worry, his mind became clearer and more focused. He discovered that his actual decision-making improved significantly when he wasn't clouding his judgment with anxiety about countless imaginary scenarios. When the day came to depart on his trading expedition, Ananda felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. His carts were properly loaded with exactly what was needed for the journey ahead, no more, no less. And his mind, for the first time in memory, was focused on the actual adventure before him rather than weighed down with the burden of carrying provisions for every possible future journey. As his caravan moved through the city gates and onto the northern road, Ananda looked back once toward the monastery where the wise monk resided. In that moment, he understood that he had received something far more valuable than business advice. He had learned the secret of mental freedom, the art of traveling light through life, carrying only what serves the present journey and leaving behind the unnecessary burdens of imaginary tomorrows. The Buddha taught, if you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. This profound insight lies at the heart of the worried merchant's transformation, revealing how our mental suffering often comes not from actual circumstances, but from our habit of living in an imaginary future. Why do we so persistently carry the weight of problems that don't exist? Buddhist psychology identifies several deeply rooted patterns that create this unnecessary suffering. First is what monks call anticipatory anxiety, the mind's tendency to experience the emotional reality of feared events before they actually occur, or even when they never occur at all. Like Ananda rehearsing conversations with bandits he might never meet. We often suffer multiple times for the same potential problem, once in anticipation, possibly during the actual event if it happens, and then again in memory. Second is our misunderstanding of what constitutes wise planning versus destructive worry. Our evolutionary ancestors survived partly by anticipating dangers and preparing for difficulties. This capacity for foresight remains valuable today. However, the modern mind often distorts this survival mechanism, transforming practical preparation into obsessive rumination about unlikely scenarios. Third is our addiction to the illusion of control. Worry often masquerades as responsibility or care, making us believe that by mentally rehearsing problems, we're somehow preventing them or preparing for them more effectively. But as the monk pointed out to Ananda, there's a crucial difference between taking appropriate action and carrying the emotional burden of imaginary difficulties. The metaphor of the overloaded caravan perfectly illustrates how worry affects our capacity to navigate life skillfully. When our mental energy is distributed across dozens of hypothetical problems, we have less clarity and focus available for dealing with actual present moment challenges. Like oxen collapsing under excessive weight, our minds become ineffective when overloaded with unnecessary concerns. Buddhist monks practice what they call present moment awareness, not as a philosophical concept, but as a practical life skill. They understand that effective action can only happen now, in this moment. Worrying about tomorrow's challenges doesn't improve tomorrow's outcomes. It only diminishes today's effectiveness and peace. This teaching doesn't encourage irresponsibility or lack of planning. Rather, it points toward what Zen masters call appropriate response, taking sensible precautions without carrying the emotional weight of countless imaginary scenarios. Like Ananda, learning to prepare his caravan wisely while leaving behind provisions for journeys not yet undertaken. We can learn to plan appropriately while releasing anxiety about problems that exist only in our imagination. The practice of distinguishing between helpful planning and harmful worry becomes a moment-by-moment meditation in daily life. When anxiety arises about future possibilities, we can ask ourselves, is there appropriate action I can take right now regarding this concern? If yes, we take the action. If no, we practice returning our attention to present moment reality. Buddhist teachings emphasize that the future is created by present actions, not by present worries. The merchant's business success came from his skillful work in each present moment, choosing quality goods, treating customers fairly, maintaining his equipment properly. His worries contributed nothing to these results. In fact, they diminished his capacity for clear thinking and skillful action. In monastery life, monks often use the practice of one day at a time, focusing their full attention on the responsibilities and opportunities of the current day, while trusting that tomorrow will bring its own appropriate challenges and resources. This doesn't mean avoiding long-term planning, but rather holding future plans lightly, without the heavy emotional investment that transforms practical preparation into mental suffering. Tonight, as you rest in the simplicity of this moment, can you feel the relief that comes from setting down the burden of tomorrow's imaginary problems? Can you sense how much lighter your mind becomes when it's not overloaded with the provisions for journeys not yet begun? Remember the Buddha's words, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment, like the wise merchant who learned to travel light." We can discover the freedom that comes from carrying only what serves our actual journey through life, leaving behind the unnecessary weight of problems that exist nowhere but in our worried imagination. High in the Himalayan mountains, where prayer flags fluttered in the thin air and ancient monasteries clung to impossible cliff faces, lived a monk named Thupten, who had spent 20 years seeking enlightenment through the most rigorous practices. He meditated for 18 hours each day, ate only one simple meal, and had memorized thousands of sacred texts. Yet despite his extraordinary discipline and devotion, he felt no closer to the profound awakening he desperately sought. Thupten had arrived at the mountain monastery as a young man filled with spiritual ambition. He had heard stories of masters who achieved sudden enlightenment, and he was determined to join their ranks through sheer force of will and effort. Each year, he intensified his practices, convinced that greater austerity would finally break through the barriers that seemed to separate him from ultimate truth. As the decades passed, however, Thupten's intense striving began to take its toll. His body grew thin and weak from excessive fasting. His mind became rigid and strained from forcing concentration. Most troubling of all, the joy and wonder that had first drawn him to spiritual life seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by a grim determination that felt increasingly hollow. One spring morning, during a brief break from his meditation schedule, Thupten was walking slowly through the monastery's small garden when something caught his attention. In a corner where the monks grew vegetables for their simple meals, he noticed what appeared to be a small brown cocoon attached to the stem of a plant. At first, he barely registered this unremarkable sight. His mind was too busy reviewing the morning's meditation session and planning adjustments to his afternoon practice. But as he passed the same spot over the following days, he found himself occasionally glancing at the motionless cocoon, wondering idly what might be developing inside its protective shell. 2 weeks later, as Thupten made his usual morning walk, he noticed small cracks beginning to appear in the cocoon's surface. Something was stirring inside. Over the next few days, he found himself making slight detours during his walks, just to observe the subtle changes taking place. On the 4th morning, Thupten witnessed something extraordinary. The cocoon began to split open, and he could see a small creature inside struggling to emerge. At first, only a tiny portion was visible, what appeared to be a fragment of wing, brilliant orange with black markings. The creature pushed and strained, working with tremendous effort to break free from its confined space. Thupten watched, fascinated, as this struggle continued for several hours. The emerging butterfly would push against the cocoon walls, rest briefly, then resume its efforts. The process seemed exhausting and difficult. At times, the butterfly appeared to make no progress at all, and Thupten found himself growing impatient with the seemingly inefficient process. His first instinct was to help. Surely, he thought, if he carefully tore open more of the cocoon, He could spare this creature its suffering and allow it to emerge more quickly and easily. He had always been someone who tried to force solutions to problems, and this situation seemed no different, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the methodical way the butterfly worked, never seeming to panic or give up despite the obvious difficulty. There was something almost meditative about its persistent, patient effort. So Thupten simply sat on a nearby stone and continued to observe. Gradually, more of the butterfly emerged. First one wing, then part of its body, then the second wing. Each stage required tremendous effort and seemed to take much longer than Thupten thought necessary. But as more of the creature became visible, he began to appreciate the extraordinary beauty that was being revealed. The wings were not just orange and black, but contained intricate patterns of gold and deep red, more magnificent than any artwork he had seen in the monastery's ancient temples. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the butterfly freed itself completely from the cocoon. But instead of immediately taking flight as Thupten expected, it remained motionless on the broken shell of its former home. Its wings, though beautiful, appeared soft and folded. For nearly an hour, the butterfly simply rested, occasionally moving its wings slightly but making no attempt to fly. Thupten began to worry. Had the struggle been too much? Was the butterfly injured or defective? Should he seek help from one of the elder monks who might know about such things? But again, something advised patience, so he continued to watch and wait. Slowly, the butterfly's wings began to extend and strengthen. The soft, crumpled appearance gave way to firm, perfectly formed wings that caught and reflected the mountain sunlight like stained glass windows. After another hour of this gradual strengthening process, the butterfly finally lifted off from its cocoon and began to fly. Thupten had never seen anything so graceful. The butterfly's flight seemed effortless and joyful as it danced among the monastery's flowers, sampling nectar and riding the mountain breezes with perfect ease. All traces of the difficult emergence process had disappeared, replaced by this display of natural freedom and beauty. As he watched the butterfly explore its new world, Thupten felt something shift deep within his understanding. For 20 years, he had been trying to force his way out of what he saw as the confining cocoon of his unenlightened state. He had pushed and strained and struggled, growing increasingly frustrated with what seemed like impossibly slow progress. Like his impulse to tear open the butterfly's cocoon, he had been trying to achieve awakening through force and impatience. But the butterfly had taught him something profound about the nature of transformation. The struggle itself was not a mistake or inefficiency to be avoided. It was an essential part of the process. Each push against the cocoon walls had been strengthening the butterfly's wings and body, preparing it for the freedom it would eventually enjoy. If Thupten had interfered and torn the cocoon open prematurely, he would have robbed the butterfly of the very struggle that was developing its capacity for flight. Over the following days, Thupten began to approach his spiritual practice with a completely different attitude. Instead of forcing his meditation, he learned to work gently but persistently with whatever arose in his mind. Instead of being frustrated with the slow pace of his development, he began to trust that each small effort was contributing to his eventual transformation in ways he couldn't immediately see. The change in his practice was remarkable. As he stopped fighting against the process of awakening and began cooperating with it, his meditation naturally deepened. The rigid determination that had characterized his practice for 2 decades softened into patient persistence. And for the first time in years, he began to experience moments of genuine joy and wonder in his spiritual life. One morning, Several months after witnessing the butterfly's emergence, Thupten was sitting in meditation when something profound occurred. Without forcing or striving, his awareness suddenly expanded beyond all familiar boundaries. The sense of being a separate self, struggling toward enlightenment, simply dissolved, replaced by a vast, open recognition of his own true nature. Like the butterfly finally taking flight, Thupten discovered that the freedom he had been seeking was not something to be achieved, but something to be allowed. The years of patient practice, including all the apparent struggles and setbacks, had been quietly preparing the conditions for this natural emergence of awakening. When he later described his experience to his teacher, the old master smiled with deep recognition. "The butterfly was an excellent guru," the teacher said. "It taught you that transformation cannot be rushed, only trusted. Every moment of difficulty in your practice was strengthening your capacity for the freedom you now enjoy." Thupten nodded, understanding that his 20 years of seemingly unsuccessful striving had not been wasted but had been the very cocoon within which his true understanding had been developing. Like the butterfly, he had needed to trust the process completely before he could discover the effortless flight that had been waiting within him all along. The Buddha taught, there is no fire like passion, no shark like hatred, no snare like folly, no torrent like greed. But he also taught that these very obstacles, when met with wisdom and patience, become the conditions for our awakening. Thupten's butterfly revealed this profound truth, that our struggles are not impediments to transformation, but the very means by which transformation occurs. Why do we so often try to force our spiritual development, like Thupten initially wanting to tear open the cocoon? Buddhist psychology points to several deeply embedded patterns in our approach to growth and change. First is our cultural conditioning toward immediate results and quick solutions. In a world of instant communication and rapid technological progress, we often bring the same expectation of speed to the inherently gradual process of inner development. Second is our misunderstanding of what spiritual effort actually involves. Many practitioners, like Thupten, confuse intense striving with effective practice. They believe that more force, longer hours, or greater austerity will accelerate their progress. But the butterfly's teaching reveals that the most profound transformations occur not through force but through patient cooperation with natural processes. Third is our tendency to view difficulties as mistakes rather than necessary stages of development. When we encounter resistance, boredom, doubt, or other challenging states in our practice, we often interpret these as signs that something is wrong. But like the butterfly's struggle to emerge from its cocoon, these difficulties are often the very experiences that are developing our capacity for greater freedom and understanding. The metamorphosis metaphor appears throughout Buddhist literature because it so accurately describes the process of awakening. Just as a caterpillar must completely dissolve its former structure to become a butterfly, spiritual transformation often requires the dissolution of our familiar sense of self and the identities we've constructed around our roles, achievements, and personal history. This process of dissolution can feel deeply uncomfortable, even frightening. Like the butterfly partially emerged from its cocoon, we may find ourselves in transitional states where we're no longer what we used to be, but haven't yet fully become what we're meant to be. These liminal periods require tremendous patience and trust in the natural unfolding of our development. Buddhist monks understand that enlightenment is not an achievement to be grasped, but a natural state to be uncovered. Like the butterfly's wings that were perfectly formed within the cocoon, but needed time and struggle to strengthen and unfold. Our Buddha nature is already complete within us, but requires patient cultivation to manifest fully. The teaching of the butterfly also illuminates the importance of timing in spiritual development. Just as Thupten learned not to interfere with the butterfly's emergence, we must learn to trust the natural timing of our own awakening process. Premature efforts to force breakthrough experiences often result in spiritual bypassing, appearing to transcend difficulties without actually integrating the lessons they contain. In monastery training, teachers often observe students going through what they call cocoon periods, times of apparent stagnation or struggle that are actually periods of intensive inner development. Wise teachers, like Thupten, learning to watch the butterfly without interference, know not to rescue students from these necessary difficulties, but to offer support and encouragement for the natural process of transformation. The butterfly's final flight represents what Buddhist texts call effortless effort, action, that flows naturally from understanding rather than from force or struggle. After years of trying to muscle his way to enlightenment, Thupten discovered that awakening emerges spontaneously when the right conditions have been established through patient practice. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet darkness, can you bring the butterfly's patience to whatever process of transformation might be occurring in your own life? Can you trust that even your difficulties and struggles might be developing capacities within you that will eventually allow for greater freedom and joy? Remember the Buddha's words, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, even so let one cultivate a boundless love towards all beings. This includes cultivating patience and compassion toward our own process of growth, trusting that like the butterfly's emergence, our awakening will unfold in its own perfect timing when we learn to cooperate with rather than force the natural wisdom of transformation. In a small mountain village in ancient Tibet, there lived a man named Norbu, whom everyone considered to be the village fool. He was simple in speech, wore patched robes that were often dirty from his work, and seemed to understand nothing about commerce, politics, or the complex social arrangements that occupied most people's attention. Children would sometimes follow him through the streets, laughing at his odd habits and strange responses to ordinary questions. Norbu worked as a street sweeper, spending his days cleaning the pathways between houses and removing debris from the village squares. He performed this humble work with such obvious contentment that it puzzled the villagers even more. Who could find joy in such menial labor? Why did he smile while cleaning up other people's messes? Surely, they thought, anyone with any intelligence would be dissatisfied with such a lowly position in life. What the villagers didn't know was that Norbu had once been a renowned scholar at one of Tibet's greatest monasteries. For 15 years, he had studied the most complex philosophical texts, engaged in sophisticated debates about the nature of reality, and earned recognition as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. He could recite thousands of verses from memory and explain the most subtle points of Buddhist logic with remarkable clarity. But all of this learning had left Norbu feeling strangely empty. Despite his intellectual achievements, he found himself no closer to the simple peace and happiness he observed in the ordinary people around him. His knowledge had become a burden rather than a blessing, separating him from direct experience behind layers of concepts and analysis. One day, his teacher had given him an unusual assignment. Norbu, the old master, had said, "You have filled your mind with the wisdom of books, but you have not yet discovered the wisdom of life itself. Go into the world and learn what cannot be found in any text." So Norbu had left the monastery and eventually found his way to this small village, where he took the job of street sweeper and began what he privately considered the most important education of his life. He deliberately adopted the appearance and behavior of a simple person, hiding his scholarly background and allowing people to see him as whatever their own minds projected. In the early morning hours, before the village awakened, Nobu would sweep the pathways with complete attention. He noticed how the light changed as the sun rose over the mountains, how different types of debris required different approaches to removal, how the rhythm of his broom created a kind of moving meditation. For the first time in years, his mind was not analyzing or categorizing his experience, but simply receiving it directly. During the day, as villagers went about their business, Nobu would continue his work quietly, listening to their conversations and observing their interactions without judgment. He began to understand human nature, not through philosophical treatises, but through direct observation of how people actually lived, worried, hoped, and struggled. One afternoon, as Nobu was sweeping near the village market, he overheard two merchants arguing bitterly about a business transaction. Their voices grew increasingly heated, and other villagers began to gather, taking sides and adding to the conflict. The situation was escalating toward potential violence. Without thinking, Nobu approached the arguing men and began sweeping very slowly and deliberately around their feet, occasionally bumping gently into their legs with his broom. At first, the merchants tried to ignore him, continuing their heated argument. But Nobu's persistent, peaceful presence gradually began to affect the atmosphere. "What are you doing, you fool?" one of the merchants finally demanded. "Can't you see we're having an important discussion?" Nobu looked up at him with innocent eyes and said simply, "I'm cleaning up the mess." The merchant was about to respond angrily when something in Nobu's gentle expression made him pause. Looking around, he suddenly became aware of the crowd that had gathered, the tension in the air, and how the entire peaceful atmosphere of the market had been disturbed by his argument. "The mess," the second merchant repeated slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his voice. Nobu continued sweeping, humming a simple tune under his breath. Gradually, the two men began to lower their voices. The crowd started to disperse. Within a few minutes, the merchants had moved to a quieter spot to discuss their business calmly, leaving the market restored to its normal, peaceful activity. Word of this incident spread through the village, and people began to pay more attention to their simple street sweeper. They started noticing how conflicts seemed to resolve themselves more easily when Nobu was around, how his presence somehow brought out the better nature in people, how his apparent simplicity often revealed the unnecessary complexity in their own problems. A wealthy merchant visiting from the capital city observed Nobu's effect on the villagers and became curious. This businessman prided himself on his ability to judge character and intelligence, and something about the street sweeper didn't quite add up. One evening, the visiting merchant approached Nobu as he was finishing his daily work. "Tell me," he said in a condescending tone, "what do you think is the most important thing in life?" Nobu leaned on his broom and considered the question with apparent seriousness. "I think," he said slowly, "the most important thing is to pay attention to what you're doing when you're doing it." The merchant laughed. "Surely you can't mean that cleaning streets is as important as managing a business empire or governing a city?" "I don't know about business empires," Nobu replied with genuine humility. "But I've noticed that when I pay complete attention to sweeping, the street becomes clean. When I pay complete attention to listening, people feel heard. When I pay complete attention to being kind, kindness appears. It seems to work the same way with everything." Something in the simplicity and directness of this response made the merchant pause. He had expected a foolish answer that would confirm his assumptions, but instead he found himself contemplating a perspective that was both obvious and profound. Over the following days, the merchant observed Norbu more carefully. He noticed how the street sweeper brought complete presence to every interaction, never appearing to be thinking about anything other than what was immediately before him. He saw how Norbu's lack of pretense allowed other people to drop their own social masks and speak more honestly than they usually did. On his final day in the village, the merchant approached Norbu again. "I've been watching you," he said, "and I suspect there's more to you than meets the eye." Norbu smiled gently. "I hope not," he replied. "I've spent many years learning to be exactly what meets the eye, nothing more, nothing less. But surely you have ambitions, goals, dreams of something greater than sweeping streets." "Every morning when I wake up," Norbu answered, "I have the opportunity to bring complete attention and kindness to whatever work needs to be done. Every evening when I rest, I can feel satisfied that the day was used well. What could be greater than this?" The merchant left the village that day, carrying with him a question he had never seriously considered. In his relentless pursuit of greater wealth, status, and achievement, had he somehow missed the simple satisfaction that came from bringing complete presence to whatever life offered? Years later, when the merchant had achieved even greater success but found himself feeling strangely empty, he would remember the village street sweeper who had discovered something that couldn't be purchased. With any amount of money, the profound contentment that comes from approaching each moment and each task as an opportunity for complete presence and genuine service. The Buddha taught, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. Norbu embodied this teaching perfectly, demonstrating how true wisdom often appears as simplicity to minds cluttered with complex knowledge and sophisticated concepts. Why do we so easily mistake complexity for wisdom and simplicity for foolishness? Buddhist understanding points to several deep-seated patterns in how we evaluate intelligence and spiritual development. First is our cultural bias toward intellectual sophistication. The assumption that wisdom must be complicated, abstract, and difficult to understand. We tend to be impressed by people who can manipulate complex concepts and skeptical of insights that can be expressed in simple, direct language. Second is our confusion between knowledge and understanding. Norbu had achieved the highest levels of scholarly knowledge during his monastery years, but this knowledge had become a barrier to direct experience rather than a bridge to it. Like many intellectually gifted people, he had to learn the difference between knowing about life and actually living with awareness and presence. Third is our tendency to equate social status with spiritual development. The villagers initially dismissed Norbu because he worked as a street sweeper, assuming that anyone truly wise would naturally rise to a position of greater prestige and power. They couldn't conceive that someone might deliberately choose humble work as a form of spiritual practice. The transformation from scholar to street sweeper represents a profound teaching about the nature of spiritual maturity. In Zen tradition, there are many stories of highly accomplished masters who took on the most humble roles: kitchen workers, janitors, gardeners, not as punishment or failure, but as opportunities to embody their understanding in the most ordinary circumstances. Norbu's approach to his work demonstrates what Buddhist monks call mindfulness in action, bringing complete presence and attention to whatever task is at hand, regardless of its social value or personal prestige. When he swept the streets with total attention, he was practicing the same quality of awareness that meditation masters cultivate on their cushions. But in the midst of daily activity, the incident with the arguing merchants reveals how genuine wisdom operates. Norbu didn't lecture them about anger, quote, philosophical texts about conflict resolution, or attempt to mediate their dispute through clever argumentation. Instead, he simply brought such quality presence to the situation that it naturally transformed the emotional atmosphere, allowing the merchant's own wisdom to emerge. This illustrates a key principle in Buddhist psychology, that our state of consciousness is contagious. When we approach difficult situations with genuine peace and clarity, we create space for others to access their own innate wisdom and compassion. Norbu's foolish behavior of sweeping around the merchant's feet was actually a skillful means of interrupting their reactive patterns without triggering their defensiveness. The visiting merchant's interaction with Norbu reveals the challenge that genuine wisdom presents to our conventional assumptions about success and achievement. Norbu's contentment with humble work and simple presence challenged the merchant's entire worldview, forcing him to question whether his relentless pursuit of greater status and wealth was actually leading toward or away from genuine satisfaction. Buddhist teachings emphasize that true wisdom is always practical and applicable to daily life. The most profound insights must eventually translate into how we treat other people, how we approach our work, and how we handle the ordinary challenges of human existence. Norbu demonstrated this integration by finding opportunities for practice and service in the most mundane activities. The concept of hiding one's light appears in many spiritual traditions and represents a mature stage of development where practitioners are more interested in embodying their understanding than in displaying it. Norbu had learned that the ego's desire for recognition and admiration could be more subtle and persistent than obviously selfish behaviors, requiring the discipline of anonymity to truly dissolve. In monastery life, there's a saying that the master appears as a servant. This doesn't mean that all wise people must take humble jobs, but rather that genuine wisdom expresses itself through service rather than dominance, through presence rather than performance, through being rather than seeming. Tonight, as you rest in the simplicity of this moment, can you appreciate the profound wisdom available in the most ordinary experiences? Can you sense how bringing complete attention to simple activities, breathing, feeling the weight of your body, noticing sounds can be as transformative as any sophisticated spiritual technique? Remember the Buddha's words, if you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your path. Norbu discovered that by approaching his humble work as an opportunity to serve others and practice presence, he found the deep satisfaction that had eluded him during years of scholarly achievement. True wisdom often hides behind the mask of simplicity, waiting to be recognized by those who have learned to see beyond appearances. In the remote valleys of ancient China, where mist clung to mountain peaks and ancient trade routes wound through treacherous passes, a group of Buddhist pilgrims was making its way to a sacred temple known for its healing relics. The journey was arduous, requiring many days of walking through difficult terrain, but the pilgrims were sustained by their faith and their shared hope for spiritual and physical healing. Leading this group was an elderly monk named Master Chen, whose reputation for wisdom and compassion had drawn followers from across the region. Among the pilgrims was a young merchant named Wei, who suffered from a chronic illness that no physician had been able to cure, a mother named Lin carrying her fevered child, and an old man named Huang seeking peace for grief that had consumed him since his wife's death. They had been traveling for 6 days, following an ancient path that was said to be the most direct route to the temple. According to their map, they should reach the sacred destination by evening of the 7th day. Their food supplies were calculated precisely for this timeline, and several of the pilgrims, particularly Wei and Lin with her sick child, were anxious to complete their journey as quickly as possible. On the morning of the 7th day, as the group crested a hill and looked down into the valley where the final leg of their journey lay, they discovered a devastating sight. The ancient stone bridge that spanned the rushing river, the only crossing point for many miles in either direction, had collapsed during recent storms. Massive stone blocks lay scattered in the turbulent water, making the river completely impassable. The pilgrims stood in shocked silence, staring at the broken bridge. Their carefully planned route was now impossible to complete. The nearest alternative crossing was at least 3 days' walk in the opposite direction, and they had insufficient food for such a detour. Some of the pilgrims, especially those who were ill or carrying heavy burdens, would struggle to make such an extended journey. "This is a disaster," Wei said, his voice filled with despair. "We've come so far, and now we're stopped by this obstacle. My condition grows worse each day. I may not have the strength for a journey twice as long as we planned." Lin clutched her fevered child closer, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter needs those healing relics. Every day we delay could mean ... double quotes. She couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear to everyone. Old Huang sat heavily on a boulder, looking older than his 70 years. "Perhaps this is a sign that we're not meant to complete this pilgrimage. Maybe some suffering is simply our fate to bear." The group's mood darkened as the full implications of their situation became clear. They had exhausted their savings to make this journey, taken time away from work and family, endured considerable hardship to reach this point. Now, through no fault of their own, their goals seemed impossibly out of reach. Master Chen remained quiet during this initial outpouring of disappointment, observing both the collapsed bridge and his companion's reactions with equal attention. Finally, he spoke in his gentle but clear voice. "Let us not decide immediately what this development means," he said. "Sometimes what appears to be the end of our path is actually a bend in the road that leads to something we could never have planned or imagined." Some of the pilgrims looked at him with barely concealed irritation. Wei spoke for several of them when he said, "Master, with all respect, this is not a philosophical puzzle but a real crisis. We need practical solutions, not riddles." Master Chen nodded with understanding. "You're absolutely right, Wei. Let us first attend to practical matters. We need to find shelter for tonight and determine what options are actually available to us." As the group made camp in a grove of trees near the broken bridge, Master Chen suggested that they spend the evening exploring the immediate area to see if there might be resources or possibilities they hadn't yet considered. Most of the pilgrims were too discouraged to join this search, preferring to rest and contemplate their limited options. However, as Master Chen walked along the riverbank in the gathering dusk, he noticed smoke rising from a small valley that branched off from the main river gorge. Following a faint path that seemed to lead toward this smoke, he discovered something remarkable: a small hermitage where an ancient Buddhist sage named Linji had lived in solitude for over 40 years. The hermitage was simple but beautiful, surrounded by gardens that had been cultivated with extraordinary care. More importantly, Master Chen could immediately sense that this place held a quality of peace and spiritual power that was even more profound than what they had expected to find at their original destination. When Master Chen introduced himself to the elderly hermit, he learned that Linji had once been a monk at the very temple they had been trying to reach. Decades earlier, he had left the increasingly crowded and politically complicated monastery to establish this quiet retreat where he could focus entirely on pure practice and service. "The temple you seek is certainly a sacred place," Linji told Master Chen over simple tea in his modest dwelling. "But its healing power comes not from its relics, but from the quality of faith and openness that pilgrims bring to their spiritual seeking. This same healing is available wherever people gather with sincere hearts." When Master Chen returned to the group and described his discovery, the pilgrims' reactions were mixed. Some were intrigued by the possibility of receiving teachings from such an accomplished master. Others remained focused on their original goal and saw this development as a consolation prize rather than a genuine opportunity. "But we came specifically for the healing relics," Lin protested, her sick daughter still burning with fever. "How do we know this hermit can provide what we need?" "We don't," Master Chen replied honestly. "But we also don't know that the collapsed bridge hasn't led us to exactly what we need, even if it's different from what we expected." Over the next 3 days, as the group remained near the hermitage, while deciding on their next course of action, something remarkable began to unfold. Sage Linji, despite his advanced age and reclusive lifestyle, proved to be a teacher of extraordinary depth and compassion. For Wei, struggling with his chronic illness, Linji offered not miraculous cures, but profound teachings about the relationship between mental suffering and physical pain. Through daily conversations and gentle meditation instruction, Wei began to experience a peace that, while it didn't eliminate his symptoms, completely transformed his relationship to his condition. For Lin and her fevered daughter, the hermit provided both practical herbal remedies from his extensive garden and a quality of caring attention that seemed to create its own healing atmosphere. Within 2 days, the child's fever broke, and Lin found herself learning from Linji about the healing power of unconditional presence. For old Huang, weighted down by grief for his deceased wife, Linji offered the companionship of someone who had spent decades exploring the deepest questions about life, death, and the nature of loss. In their quiet conversations, Huang began to discover that his grief, rather than being an obstacle to spiritual development, could become a doorway to profound compassion and understanding. By the end of their stay, even the pilgrims who had been most resistant to this change of plans had to acknowledge that they had received exactly the teaching and healing they had needed, though in forms they never could have anticipated. On their final morning at the hermitage, as the group prepared to return to their various homes, Master Chen gathered them together for a final reflection on their journey. "When we first saw the broken bridge," he said, "we experienced it as a disaster that had derailed our carefully laid plans. But looking back now, can we see it differently?" Wei spoke first. "I realize now that I was so focused on reaching a specific place to find healing that I almost missed the healing that was available right where the obstacle appeared." Lin nodded, her daughter now healthy and playful in her arms. "The broken bridge didn't prevent us from receiving what we needed. It led us to it by a path we never could have planned ourselves." Old Huang, who seemed to have recovered a sense of wonder that grief had obscured, added, "I think the bridge broke at exactly the right moment. If we had been able to cross it, we would have missed this hermitage entirely. Sometimes obstacles are actually invitations to discover gifts that are hidden just off our intended path, Master." Chen smiled with deep satisfaction. "This is one of the most important teachings we can receive about the spiritual journey. Our plans and expectations, no matter how reasonable or well-intentioned, are based on our limited perspective. When life redirects our path, it's often guiding us toward opportunities and insights that we couldn't have conceived." From our original viewpoint, as the pilgrims began their journey home, they carried with them not the relics they had originally sought, but something far more valuable, The direct experience that obstacles often become doorways when met with openness rather than resistance, and that the spiritual journey's greatest gifts are frequently found not at our planned destinations but at the unexpected turns where our maps no longer provide guidance. The Buddha taught, there are only two mistakes one can make along the road to truth: not going all the way and not starting. The broken bridge in our story represents those moments when we cannot continue along our planned path, when life forces us to reconsider our direction and discover new possibilities we never could have imagined. Why do we experience such distress when our carefully laid plans are disrupted? Buddhist psychology identifies several deeply ingrained patterns that make us resistant to unexpected changes in our life direction. First is our attachment to specific outcomes. The way we convince ourselves that happiness or fulfillment can only come through achieving particular goals in particular ways. Like the pilgrims focused exclusively on reaching the temple with healing relics, we often become so fixated on our intended destination that we miss opportunities that appear along the way. Second is our illusion of control. The belief that we can and should be able to direct the course of our lives through planning and effort alone. When external circumstances, like the collapsed bridge, interfere with our intentions, we experience this as a personal failure rather than a natural part of life's organic unfolding. We forget that we are participants in a vast web of interconnected causes and conditions, many of which lie completely outside our influence or understanding. Third is our tendency to catastrophize obstacles, immediately interpreting any disruption to our plans as evidence that something has gone wrong or that we're being punished or tested. This catastrophic thinking prevents us from remaining open to the possibility that apparent obstacles might actually be redirections towards something beneficial that we couldn't have discovered on our original path. The hermitage that the pilgrims discovered represents what Buddhist teachers call hidden blessings, opportunities for growth, healing, or understanding that become visible only when our original plans are interrupted. These hidden blessings often prove more valuable than what we were originally seeking, but they require a quality of openness and trust that can be difficult to maintain when we're disappointed about our disrupted expectations. Master Chen's response to the broken bridge demonstrates the Buddhist practice of holding outcomes lightly. This doesn't mean becoming passive or abandoning all planning, but rather maintaining a fundamental openness to life's natural intelligence, trusting that circumstances often conspire to guide us toward what we truly need even when they initially appear to be blocking our path. The different ways the pilgrims responded to their unexpected detour illustrates common patterns in how people handle major life disruptions. Some, like Wei initially, focus primarily on what they're losing and struggle to see any potential benefits in the changed situation. Others, like Master Chen, have cultivated the ability to remain curious about how apparent obstacles might actually serve their deeper well-being. In Buddhist monasteries, there's a practice called sacred inconvenience, deliberately allowing small disruptions to daily routines as a way of practicing flexibility and non-attachment to specific outcomes. Monks might change their meditation schedule, alter their walking routes, or adjust their meal times to cultivate the inner freedom that comes from not being rigidly attached to particular ways of doing things. The healing that each pilgrim received at the hermitage was perfectly suited to their individual needs, suggesting that life's redirections often guide us toward exactly what we need for our development, even when it's different from what we think we want. Wei needed to learn about the relationship between mental and physical suffering. Lin needed to experience the healing power of presence and community. Huang needed companionship in exploring grief as a spiritual pathway. This teaching applies profoundly to the major disruptions many people experience: job losses that lead to more fulfilling careers, relationship endings that create space for personal growth, health crises that redirect priorities toward what truly matters. While these experiences are often initially painful and disorienting, they frequently guide us toward insights and opportunities that wouldn't have emerged if our original plans had proceeded smoothly. The concept of divine timing in many spiritual traditions reflects this understanding that life events unfold according to a wisdom that often transcends our conscious planning. The bridge collapsed at precisely the moment when the pilgrims were ready to receive what the hermitage could offer. And after they had developed sufficient determination and openness through their difficult journey, tonight, as you reflect on the unexpected turns your own life has taken, can you identify any broken bridges that initially seemed like disasters but ultimately guided you toward growth, understanding, or opportunities you couldn't have planned? Can you bring the same openness to current obstacles that Master Chen demonstrated, remaining curious about how apparent setbacks might actually be redirections toward hidden blessings? Remember the Buddha's words: "What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow." When we approach life's inevitable obstacles with openness rather than resistance, with curiosity rather than catastrophic thinking, we create the mental conditions where hidden blessings can reveal themselves and guide us toward forms of fulfillment we never could have imagined. In a remote monastery, high in the mountains of ancient Tibet, where the winter winds howled through gaps in stone walls and temperatures dropped far below freezing for months at a time, the monks had developed a beautiful tradition for dealing with the season's harsh darkness. Each evening, as the sun disappeared behind the peaks and deep cold settled over the monastery, one of the elder monks would light a single candle in the central meditation hall. This was no ordinary candle, but one that had been crafted with special care from beeswax mixed with fragrant herbs and blessed oils. The candle was designed to burn steadily through the entire night, providing both warmth and a gentle light that transformed the meditation hall into a sanctuary of peace amid the surrounding darkness and cold. The tradition held that any monk who felt drawn to do so could light his own candle from this central flame, creating a small circle of warmth and light around his meditation cushion. There was no formal rule about this practice, no requirement or schedule, simply an open invitation for anyone who wished to participate in this quiet communion of light. Brother Tenzin, a young monk who had arrived at the monastery only months before, was initially hesitant to participate in this evening ritual. He had been raised in poverty and was accustomed to conserving resources carefully. The idea of lighting additional candles seemed wasteful to him, particularly during the harsh winter months when supplies were precious and difficult to replenish. Night after night, Tenzin would sit in the meditation hall wrapped in his heavy robes, practicing by the light of the single central candle, while other monks gradually lit their own flames from it. He couldn't understand why they would use extra resources when the one candle provided sufficient light for everyone to meditate. One evening, as Tenzin sat shivering slightly in the drafty hall, an elderly monk named Lobsang approached him carrying an unlit candle. Brother Lobsang said gently, "Would you like to light a candle this evening? The cold seems particularly bitter tonight." Tenzin shook his head politely. "Thank you, elder brother, but I don't wish to waste resources. The central candle provides enough light, and I can manage the cold." Lobsang smiled with understanding but didn't immediately move away. "May I ask you something, young brother? Do you believe that lighting your candle would somehow diminish the central flame?" "Well, no," Tenzin replied, somewhat puzzled by the question. "But it would use up one more candle from our limited supplies." "Indeed it would," Lobsang agreed. "But watch closely." The elder monk held his unlit candle to the central flame. As his wick caught fire, creating a second dancing light, the original flame continued burning with exactly the same brightness and intensity as before. "You see," Lobsang continued, settling onto a cushion nearby, "this is one of the great mysteries of light. Unlike material resources, which are diminished when shared, light multiplies when given away. The central flame loses nothing by lighting my candle, yet now we have twice as much light in the hall." Tenzin considered this observation carefully. It was true that the original flame appeared completely unchanged, but he remained concerned about the practical matter of candle consumption. Over the following nights, Tenzin began to pay more attention to the dynamics of the evening candle lighting. He noticed that, as more monks lit their individual candles, the meditation hall became not just brighter, but somehow warmer and more peaceful. The combined light created a sense of community and shared purpose that the single central flame, though beautiful, couldn't achieve alone. More importantly, he observed that monks seemed to meditate more deeply and peacefully when surrounded by this collective glow. Their practice appeared to be enhanced by participating in this simple act of creating light together. Even though each person sat in silent individual meditation. One particularly cold evening, when the wind was howling fiercely outside and the stone walls seemed to radiate chill, Tenzin found himself struggling to maintain concentration during his sitting practice. His body was tense with cold, and his mind kept wandering to thoughts of his warm bed and worries about whether the monastery's fuel supplies would last through the winter. Elder Lobsang, noticing Tenzin's discomfort, approached him again with an unlit candle. "Brother," he said quietly, "tonight I invite you to discover something important about the nature of giving and receiving." This time, Tenzin accepted the candle. As he held his wick to the central flame and watched his own light spring to life, he felt an immediate sense of participation in something larger than his individual practice. The small circle of warmth around his cushion was certainly pleasant, but more significant was the feeling of contributing to the collective light that filled the entire hall. As the days passed and Tenzin continued to participate in the evening candle lighting, he began to understand that Elder Lobsang's lesson extended far beyond questions of light and warmth. He noticed that when he shared his own knowledge with newer monks, his understanding didn't diminish, but actually seemed to deepen through the process of explanation. When he offered emotional support to a brother struggling with homesickness, his own sense of connection and belonging increased rather than decreased. Most profoundly, Tenzin discovered that his meditation practice itself was like a candle flame. When he meditated with sincere dedication, the peace and clarity he generated seemed to radiate outward, creating an atmosphere that supported other monks' practice without diminishing his own inner development. One evening, several weeks after he had begun participating in the candle lighting tradition, Tenzin was approached by a newly arrived monk who seemed hesitant and uncertain about monastery customs. "Brother," the newcomer said quietly, "I've noticed that everyone lights candles during evening meditation, but I don't want to waste resources or appear presumptuous." Tenzin smiled, recognizing his own earlier concerns in the young monk's words. "Come with me," he said, picking up an unlit candle. "Let me show you something remarkable about the nature of light." As Tenzin held the newcomer's candle to his own flame and watched a new light spring to life. He felt a deep understanding of what Elder Lobsang had been teaching him. The light he shared came from the central flame, which had come from countless other flames before it, stretching back through generations of monks who had participated in this simple practice of creating light together. "You see," Tenzin said to the newcomer as they settled onto their cushions, surrounded by the warm glow of their candles, "we're not really consuming resources when we light these flames. We're participating in an endless chain of giving that somehow creates more light than it uses." Over the years, as Tenzin matured in his practice and understanding, he came to see that the monastery's candle-lighting tradition was a perfect metaphor for the entire spiritual path. Each person's sincere practice, like an individual candle flame, contributed to a collective illumination that supported everyone's development, while diminishing no one's personal growth. The central flame represented the timeless wisdom of Buddhist teaching, which could light countless individual understanding without ever being diminished. And the individual candles represented each practitioner's unique contribution to the Sangha, the spiritual community that was somehow greater than the sum of its individual members. When Tenzin eventually became an elder monk himself, responsible for teaching newcomers about monastery life and practice, he always made sure to share the lesson of the candle flame. "True wealth," he would tell them, "is like light itself. The more we share it, the more we have. The more we give it away, the brighter our own flame burns." The Buddha taught, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. Brother Tenzin's discovery at the monastery illuminates this profound truth about the nature of spiritual wealth and the mysterious mathematics of giving. Why do we so often approach generosity from a scarcity mindset, like Tenzin initially hoarding resources out of fear of depletion? Buddhist psychology identifies several deeply conditioned patterns that make us cautious about sharing what we have. First is our survival-based thinking, rooted in evolutionary adaptations that helped our ancestors survive in environments where resources were genuinely limited and sharing might mean personal deprivation or death. Second is our confusion between material and spiritual wealth. While material resources operate according to the mathematics of scarcity, when we give away money or food, we have less for ourselves. Spiritual qualities like love, wisdom, peace, and joy operate according to completely different principles. These inner treasures multiply when shared, yet our minds often treat them as if they were finite commodities. Third is our misunderstanding of what constitutes true security. Tenzin initially believed that conserving candles would provide safety and stability, but he discovered that participating in the community's shared light actually created a more profound and lasting sense of security than individual hoarding could ever achieve. The monastery's candle-lighting tradition demonstrates what Buddhist teachers call merit multiplied through sharing. In Buddhist understanding, merit, the positive spiritual energy generated through wholesome actions, doesn't diminish when shared, but actually increases through the process of giving. When we meditate, practice compassion, or cultivate wisdom, we generate beneficial energy that naturally radiates outward, supporting others' spiritual development while strengthening our own. This principle applies powerfully to teaching and learning. Many people hesitate to share their knowledge or insights, fearing that giving away what they know will somehow diminish their own understanding or competitive advantage. But like the candle flame that lights countless others without dimming, genuine wisdom grows stronger when shared. The act of explaining, demonstrating, or embodying our understanding for others deepens and clarifies our own realization. The collective illumination created by multiple candles represents what monks call Sangha power. The way individual practitioners support each other's development simply by practicing sincerely together. Each person's meditation, like each candle flame, creates an atmosphere that makes everyone else's practice easier and more effective. This mutual support happens naturally, without effort or intention, as a result of the shared commitment to awakening. Buddhist monasteries have long understood that spiritual development, paradoxically, flourishes through both solitary practice and community participation. Like the monks who meditated individually but in the shared light of collective candles, practitioners need both personal discipline and the support that comes from practicing alongside others who share similar aspirations. The teaching of the candle flame also illuminates the nature of spiritual lineage, the way wisdom is transmitted from teacher to student across generations. Each genuine teacher is like a candle lit from the original flame of the Buddha's awakening, passing on the light of Dharma to new students without diminishing their own realization. The light each student receives is identical in essence to what the teacher possesses, yet uniquely expressed through their individual understanding and circumstances. In daily life, this principle applies to countless situations where we might hold back from sharing our gifts, skills, or inner qualities. Parents sometimes worry that giving too much love or attention to one child will leave less for their other children, not realizing that love, like light, multiplies when shared. Teachers may hesitate to fully support a student's development, fearing that the student will surpass them, not understanding that a teacher's greatness is measured precisely by their students' achievements. The transformation in Tenzin's approach to the candle lighting ceremony reflects a fundamental shift from scarcity consciousness to abundance consciousness. Instead of asking, "What might I lose by giving?" he learned to ask what might be created through sharing. This shift in perspective reveals opportunities for generosity and connection that are invisible from a scarcity-based mindset. Tonight, as you rest in the gentle darkness, can you sense the places in your life where you might be hoarding light, holding back your love, wisdom, compassion, or simple presence out of fear that sharing will somehow diminish what you have? Can you imagine how your own inner flame might burn brighter through the generous act of lighting others' candles? Remember the Buddha's words, "The gift of truth exceeds all gifts. The taste of truth exceeds all tastes. The joy of truth exceeds all joys," like the monastery's central candle that could light infinite flames without losing its own brightness. The spiritual truths we embody become more radiant, not dimmer, when we share them freely with anyone ready to receive their light. In the great monastic university of Nalanda, during the golden age of Buddhist learning in ancient India, there lived a young scholar named Rahul, who possessed one of the most inquiring minds anyone had ever encountered. From his earliest days as a novice monk, Rahul had demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about every aspect of Buddhist philosophy, meditation, practice, and monastic life. Unlike many students who were content to memorize teachings and repeat traditional answers, Rahul had a gift for asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. His questions were so penetrating and original that they often left even the most accomplished teachers speechless, sending them back to their texts and contemplation to search for adequate responses. Why do we bow to statues of the Buddha when the Buddha taught that attachment to form creates suffering? Rahul would ask, if all phenomena are impermanent, how can there be an eternal Dharma? If enlightenment is already our true nature, why do we need to practice to achieve it? If compassion is natural to awakened beings, why do some masters seem harsh or distant? Initially, Rahul's teachers were impressed by his intellectual brilliance and philosophical sophistication. His questions demonstrated deep thinking and serious engagement with the teachings. Several senior monks predicted that he would become one of the great scholars of his generation, perhaps writing commentaries that would influence Buddhist thought for centuries. But as months turned into years, some of Rahul's teachers began to grow concerned about the direction of his studies. While his questions remained as sharp and insightful as ever, he seemed to be accumulating more questions faster than he was finding answers. Every response his teachers provided would generate 3 new questions. Every text he studied would raise 5 more points of confusion. Every meditation instruction would prompt a dozen inquiries about technique, purpose, and underlying assumptions. Master Nagaruna, the most senior teacher at Nalanda and a philosopher of legendary wisdom, observed Rahul's development with particular interest. He noticed that while the young monk's knowledge continued to expand impressively, his peace and contentment seemed to be diminishing. The more Rahul learned, the more agitated he became. The more questions he asked, the more uncertain he felt about everything. One afternoon, after Rahul had spent an entire class period raising complex questions about the nature of consciousness that left everyone, including the teacher, feeling more confused than when they began, Master Nagaruna invited the young scholar for a private conversation. Rahul, the master, began as they walked together through Nalanda's peaceful gardens. "You have one of the finest minds I have encountered in decades of teaching. Your questions are penetrating and your analysis is sophisticated. Yet I sense that you may be becoming lost in your own intellectual brilliance." Rahul was surprised by this observation. "Master, surely the purpose of study is to understand the Dharma as deeply as possible. How can asking questions be a problem?" "Questions are not the problem," Nagaruna replied. "But tell me, when you ask a question, what are you hoping to achieve?" "Understanding, of course. Knowledge, clarity about the teachings. And when you receive an answer, what typically happens next?" Rahul considered this carefully. "Well, usually the answer leads to new questions. Often the response raises issues I hadn't considered before, which require further investigation." "Indeed. And how does this process feel to you?" For the first time, Rahul paused to examine his own inner experience rather than analyzing external concepts. "If I'm honest," he said slowly, "it often feels quite frustrating. The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. Every answer seems to reveal how shallow my previous understanding was." Master Nagarjuna nodded knowingly. "This is what I call the scholar's trap. The belief that understanding comes through accumulating more and more information, asking cleverer and cleverer questions, building more and more complex conceptual frameworks, but surely intellectual. Understanding is important for spiritual development." Rahul protested. "Absolutely. But there are different kinds of understanding and different ways of approaching truth. Tell me, have you ever experienced a moment during your studies when a question simply dissolved without being answered?" Rahul looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes," the master explained, "instead of finding the answer to our question, we discovered that the question itself was based on a misunderstanding or false assumption. When we see this clearly, the question doesn't get answered, it disappears." As they continued walking, Master Nagarjuna led Rahul to a small pond where lotus flowers bloomed in perfect silence. "Consider these lotus blossoms," he said. "Do they ask questions about how to bloom? Do they debate the proper technique for opening their petals? Do they analyze the philosophical implications of their growth? No, of course not. They simply bloom naturally when conditions are right. Precisely. And yet their blooming is perfect, complete, and beautiful. Now, I'm not suggesting that humans should never think or inquire. Questions and analysis have their place. But I am suggesting that there might be a different way of approaching truth, one that relies less on asking questions and more on creating the conditions where understanding can naturally arise. Over the following weeks, Master Nagarjuna gave Rahul a unique assignment. For the next month, he said, I want you to practice what I call questioning the questioner. Instead of asking questions about Buddhist philosophy, I want you to investigate the one who is asking the questions. Who is this I that wants to understand? What is the nature of the mind that formulates these inquiries? Initially, Rahul found this assignment frustrating and confusing. He was accustomed to directing his analytical abilities outward, toward concepts and doctrines. Turning his attention inward, toward the questioner itself, felt vague and unproductive. But gradually, something began to shift in Rahul's approach to study and practice. As he observed his own mind during meditation and daily activities, he started to notice patterns in his thinking that he had never seen before. He recognized how his questions often arose from a desire to feel secure and in control, to have definitive answers that would eliminate uncertainty and doubt. More significantly, he began to notice gaps in his questioning, moments of pure awareness that existed before questions arose. Spaces of simple knowing that didn't require analysis or explanation. These gaps were brief at first, but they contained a quality of peace and clarity that all his intellectual understanding had never provided. One morning, during his regular meditation practice, Rahul was contemplating one of his favorite philosophical puzzles when something extraordinary happened. Instead of formulating yet another question about the puzzle, he suddenly found himself resting in the awareness that was observing the puzzle. For several minutes, there was no questioner and no questions, only clear, peaceful presence. When the meditation period ended, Rahul realized that he had experienced the kind of understanding that couldn't be captured in concepts or expressed through questions. It was knowledge that came through being rather than thinking, understanding that arose from stillness rather than analysis. Later that day, when Rahul met with Master Nagarjuna for their regular discussion, his teacher immediately noticed a change in the young monk's presence. "How was your meditation this morning?" Nagarjuna asked. Instead of launching into his usual detailed analysis of his practice, Rahul was quiet for a long moment. "Master," he said finally, "I think I'm beginning to understand the difference between knowledge that comes through questions and knowledge that comes through questionless awareness. What have you discovered?" "I've discovered that some understanding can only arise when the mind becomes still enough to receive it directly, without the filter of questioning and analysis. Questions have their place, but they can also become a barrier to the very understanding they're meant to reveal." Master Nagarjuna smiled with deep satisfaction. "And how will you approach your studies differently now?" Rahul considered this carefully. "I think I'll try to balance my analytical inquiry with periods of receptive stillness. I'll ask questions when they serve understanding, but I'll also practice resting in the awareness that exists before questions arise." Years later, when Rahul had become a respected teacher himself, students would often comment on the unique quality of his instruction. Unlike many scholars who would answer questions with more complex information, Rahul had developed the skill of helping students discover the understanding that lay beyond their questions. The deepest truths, he would tell his students, cannot be captured in answers because they exist in a realm that transcends questions. Our analytical mind is a valuable tool, but it cannot reach the most profound aspects of reality. Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from asking better questions, but from resting in the stillness where questions have not yet arisen. The Buddha taught, "Better to travel well than to arrive." Rahul's journey from compulsive questioning to balanced inquiry illuminates this teaching, showing how the quality of our spiritual approach often matters more than the information we accumulate or the answers we collect. Why do we become trapped in what Master Nagarjuna called the scholar's trap? Believing that understanding comes primarily through intellectual analysis. Buddhist psychology identifies several patterns that create this confusion between knowledge and wisdom. First is our cultural conditioning that equates intelligence with the ability to formulate complex questions and provide sophisticated answers. From early education through academic and professional life, we're rewarded for analytical thinking, often at the expense of developing other ways of knowing. Second is our anxiety about uncertainty, which drives us to seek definitive answers to questions that may not have conceptual solutions, like Rahul generating endless questions about Buddhist philosophy. We often use intellectual inquiry as a way of feeling secure and in control, not realizing that this very seeking for certainty can become an obstacle to the direct understanding we're pursuing. Third is our misunderstanding of what constitutes spiritual progress. We often measure our development by how much we know about spiritual subjects, rather than by how much peace, wisdom, or compassion we embody. This leads to what Buddhist teachers call spiritual materialism, treating insights and understanding as possessions, to accumulate rather than as qualities to embody. The distinction Rahul discovered between different types of understanding reflects a fundamental teaching in Buddhist epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. Intellectual understanding, while valuable, is always mediated through concepts, language, and mental constructs. Direct understanding, by contrast, arises through immediate experience that transcends conceptual frameworks. Buddhist meditation practices are designed to cultivate this direct way of knowing. When we sit in stillness and observe our breath, thoughts, and sensations without trying to analyze or understand them conceptually, we develop what monks call bare attention, awareness that receives experience directly, without the filter of mental commentary. This doesn't mean that questioning and analysis are spiritual obstacles. The Buddha himself encouraged intelligent inquiry and spent 45 years answering questions from students and seekers. But he distinguished between questions that serve understanding and questions that serve ego gratification, intellectual pride, or anxiety avoidance. Skillful questions arise from genuine curiosity and are held lightly with openness to whatever response might emerge. Unskillful questions often arise from a desire to demonstrate cleverness, challenge authority, or avoid the vulnerability of not knowing. Master Nagarjuna helped Rahul recognize when his questioning had shifted from serving understanding to serving his ego's need to feel intellectually superior. The practice of questioning the questioner that Nagarjuna assigned to Rahul appears throughout contemplative traditions. In Zen, this might take the form of asking who is asking this question. In Advaita Vedanta, it might involve investigating who wants to know. These inquiries turn attention away from conceptual content toward the nature of awareness itself. The lotus flower metaphor that Master Nagarjuna used illustrates the principle of natural unfolding versus forced development. Just as flowers bloom spontaneously when conditions are right, Understanding often arises naturally when we create the proper conditions through practice, patience, and receptivity rather than through intellectual force. Buddhist monasteries have long maintained a balance between scholarly study and contemplative practice precisely to avoid the scholar's trap. Monks study texts and engage in philosophical debate, but they also spend extensive time in meditation, manual labor, and other practices that cultivate direct experience rather than conceptual knowledge. The transformation in Rahul's teaching style reflects this balanced approach. Instead of simply providing more information to students' questions, he learned to help them discover the understanding that existed beyond their need to question. This requires a different kind of skillfulness, knowing when to offer explanations and when to guide students toward direct realization. In daily life, this teaching applies to our relationship with problems, challenges, and uncertainties. While appropriate analysis and planning are often necessary, we can also become trapped in cycles of endless worry, rumination, and problem-solving that generate more questions than solutions. Learning to rest periodically in aware presence without trying to figure everything out often allows insights and solutions to arise naturally. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet space between thoughts, can you notice the awareness that exists before questions arise? Can you sense the stillness that holds both questions and answers? The peaceful presence that doesn't need to understand everything in order to be complete. Remember the Buddha's words, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." The understanding we seek through questioning is valuable, but the deepest peace comes from recognizing the awareness that observes all questions, the consciousness that remains untouched by our need to know everything about life's great mysteries. On the windswept plateau of ancient Mongolia, where vast grasslands stretched endlessly in all directions and sudden storms could arise from clear skies with terrifying force, there stood a small Buddhist monastery that had somehow survived for 3 centuries despite the region's notoriously harsh weather. The monastery was built around a single, extraordinary tree, an ancient elm that had been growing there long before the first monks arrived. This tree was legendary throughout the region for its ability to survive the fierce winds that regularly swept across the plateau, while other trees in the area were either blown down by storms or grew stunted and bent from constantly fighting against the wind. This elm had grown tall and strong, its branches reaching majestically toward the sky. What made this tree remarkable was not its resistance to the wind, but its relationship with it. Travelers would stop at the monastery specifically to watch this tree during windstorms, amazed by how it moved. Instead of standing rigid and fighting against the gusting air, the tree would bend and sway with extraordinary grace, its trunk curving sometimes almost to the ground during the fiercest gales, yet always springing back upright when the wind subsided. The monks had built their monastery around this tree not just for its beauty, but because they recognized it as a profound teacher. They called it the dancing tree because of its fluid, graceful response to the wind's changing rhythms. Among the monks who lived at this remote monastery was a young man named Batbayar, who had arrived 3 years earlier, carrying deep anger and resentment from a difficult past. Before becoming a monk, Batbayar had been a warrior in the service of a local chieftain, and he had experienced betrayals and injustices that left him with a heart hardened by bitterness and a mind consumed by thoughts of revenge. Batbayar had come to the monastery hoping that Buddhist teachings might help him find peace, but he approached spiritual practice the same way he had approached warfare, with rigid discipline, fierce determination, and an unwillingness to yield to anything that challenged his will. When difficult emotions arose during meditation, he would fight against them with all his strength. When other monks disagreed with his opinions, he would argue forcefully until he had either convinced them or driven them away. When the abbot gave instructions that didn't align with his preferences, he would comply outwardly while inwardly maintaining rigid resistance. This approach to monastic life created constant suffering for Bat Bayar and frequent conflicts with his fellow monks. He was like a tree that stood stiff and unyielding against every breeze, exhausting himself in constant resistance to the natural fluctuations of community life. The monastery's abbot, a wise old man named Gamboyev, had been observing Bat Bayar's struggles with patient concern. He recognized the young monk's sincere desire for spiritual development, but he could also see how Bat Bayar's habitual resistance was preventing any real progress or peace. One afternoon, as a particularly fierce storm approached the monastery, Abbot Gamboyev invited Bat Bayar to join him in the courtyard where they could observe the dancing tree during the approaching tempest. "Brother Bat Bayar," the abbot said as they settled on a bench facing the great elm, "you have been with us for 3 years now, and I sense that you are still struggling to find the peace you seek. Perhaps this tree can teach us something about the nature of strength and flexibility." Bat Bayar looked skeptically at the tree, which at the moment stood perfectly still in the calm air that precedes a storm. "With respect, Master, I don't see what a tree can teach about spiritual development." As if responding to his words, the first gusts of wind began to reach the monastery. Immediately, the dancing tree began to move, its branches swaying gently at first, then more dramatically as the wind increased in intensity. "Watch carefully," Abbot Gamboyev said. "What do you observe?" "I see a tree bending in the wind," Bat Bayar replied matter-of-factly. "Yes, but look more closely. Is the tree being damaged by this bending?" As the storm intensified, the tree's movements became even more dramatic. Its trunk curved and swayed, its branches flowed like water, and at times the whole tree seemed to be dancing with wild abandon. Yet there was something unmistakably graceful and controlled about its movements, as if it were partnering with the wind rather than being victimized by it. "It's beautiful," Bat Bayar admitted with surprise. "But surely such extreme bending must be weakening the tree." "This tree," the abbot explained, "has survived here for over 400 years, weathering countless storms that have destroyed other trees throughout this region. Its strength comes not from rigidity but from flexibility. It has learned to move with forces it cannot control rather than exhausting itself in futile resistance." As they continued watching, Bat Bayar began to notice details he had missed initially. The tree's roots, he observed, remained firmly planted even as its trunk bent dramatically. Its fundamental stability came from this deep grounding, which allowed the upper portions to move freely without the tree losing its essential integrity. "See how the roots hold steady while the branches dance," Abbot Gamboyev pointed out. "This is the perfect balance between firmness and flexibility. The tree is neither so rigid that it breaks, nor so loose that it's uprooted." After the storm passed and the tree had returned to its upright position, showing no signs of damage despite the dramatic bending it had endured, the abbot turned to Bat Bayar with a gentle question. "How do you typically respond when life presents you with forces you cannot control?" Bat Bayar thought about his recent struggles in the monastery, his conflicts with other monks, his resistance to community decisions he disagreed with, his battles against difficult emotions during meditation. "I try to stand firm," he said. "I resist. I fight back. And how has this approach been working for you?" For the first time since arriving at the monastery, Bat Bayar allowed himself to honestly assess his experience. "Not well," he admitted. "I'm exhausted from constant fighting, and I don't seem to be making any progress toward the peace I came here to find." Over the following weeks, Abbot Gamboyev encouraged Bat Bayar to study the dancing tree more carefully and to experiment with applying its lessons to his daily monastic life. This was more challenging than Bat Bayar had expected, as his habitual patterns of resistance were deeply ingrained. The first test came during a community meeting where the monks were discussing changes to their daily schedule. Bat Bayar's immediate impulse was to argue against any modifications to routines he had grown comfortable with. But remembering the tree's graceful yielding to the wind, he experimented with listening more and speaking less, allowing the discussion to flow around him without immediately positioning himself for or against various proposals. To his surprise, this approach felt much less exhausting than his usual argumentative stance. Moreover, by listening carefully to different viewpoints instead of preparing his rebuttals, he began to understand aspects of community life that he had never noticed before. The deeper test came during his meditation practice, when difficult emotions arose: anger about past injustices, sadness about losses he had endured, fear about an uncertain future. Bat Bayar's habitual response had been to fight against these feelings, trying to suppress or eliminate them through sheer force of will. Inspired by the dancing tree's relationship with the wind, Bat Bayar began experimenting with a different approach. Instead of resisting difficult emotions, he tried allowing them to move through his awareness the way wind moved through the tree's branches. He discovered that when he stopped fighting against these feelings, they often passed much more quickly and with less disturbance to his underlying peace. The most profound shift came when Bat Bayar began to understand the difference between his roots and his branches. Like the tree, he had certain fundamental principles and commitments that remained steady regardless of changing circumstances. His dedication to spiritual development, his basic compassion for others, his commitment to honest living, these formed his roots, providing stability and integrity. But he also had many opinions, preferences, and emotional reactions that, like the tree's branches, could bend and flow with changing conditions without compromising his essential nature. Learning to distinguish between these levels of his being allowed him to remain flexible in response to life's storms while maintaining his core identity and values. Over the months, the other monks began to notice a remarkable transformation in Bat Bayar. The rigid, argumentative warrior gradually evolved into someone who could engage with disagreement and difficulty in a much more fluid and peaceful way. He still held strong convictions, but he held them lightly, able to bend when circumstances required flexibility without losing his fundamental integrity. One evening, 2 years after his first storm-watching session with the abbot, Bat Bayar was sitting beneath the dancing tree when a young monk recently arrived from the city approached him. "Brother Bat Bayar," the newcomer said, "I'm struggling with meditation. Every time I sit, my mind is filled with thoughts and emotions that I can't control. The harder I try to stop them, the more agitated I become. Do you have any advice?" Bat Bayar looked up at the branches above them, swaying gently in the evening breeze, and smiled. "Let me tell you," he said, "about what this tree has taught me about the difference between strength and rigidity, between yielding and giving up." As Bat Bayar shared the lessons he had learnt from the dancing tree, he realized that his own transformation had been like that of the tree itself, not a change in his fundamental nature, but a discovery of how to work with life's inevitable storms rather than against them. He had learned to dance, the Buddha taught, The green reed which bends in the wind is stronger than the mighty oak which breaks in a storm. Transformation through observing the dancing tree illuminates this profound teaching about the relationship between true strength and adaptive flexibility. Why do we so often confuse rigidity with strength, resistance with integrity? Buddhist psychology identifies several deeply conditioned patterns that create this confusion. First is our survival-based programming, which often interprets yielding as weakness and associates safety with control. From an evolutionary perspective, our ancestors who were most successful at fighting threats and maintaining dominance often had better chances of survival, creating genetic and cultural tendencies toward aggressive resistance when faced with challenges. Second is our misunderstanding of what constitutes personal integrity. Many people, like Batbaya initially, believe that maintaining their identity requires rigid adherence to all their opinions, preferences, and emotional reactions. They fear that flexibility in response to changing circumstances means compromising their authentic self or betraying their core values. Third is our cultural conditioning around masculine strength, which often equates power with the ability to remain unmoved by external forces. This conditioning can make both men and women reluctant to acknowledge that true strength sometimes requires yielding, that wisdom sometimes looks like surrender, and that the most resilient people are often those who can bend without breaking. The dancing tree's survival strategy demonstrates what Taoist philosophy calls wu-wei action, that flows in harmony with natural forces rather than against them. This doesn't mean passive submission to everything that happens, but rather intelligent cooperation with circumstances we cannot change while maintaining our essential integrity and purpose. The distinction Abbot Gamboyev helped Batbaya understand between roots and branches is crucial for developing this kind of flexible strength. Our roots represent our deepest values, commitments, and understanding. These remain stable even as our surface expressions adapt to changing conditions. Our branches represent our opinions, preferences, moods, and reactions. These can flow and bend without compromising our fundamental nature. Buddhist monasteries have long used natural metaphors like trees, water, and mountains to teach principles of spiritual development because nature demonstrates perfect balance between stability and change. The dancing tree had found the optimal relationship with its environment, neither so rigid that it would break nor so loose that it would be uprooted. In meditation practice, this teaching applies directly to how we work with difficult mental and emotional states. Beginning practitioners often approach meditation like Batbaya initially approached community life, with rigid resistance to anything uncomfortable or unwanted. They fight against wandering thoughts, struggle with painful emotions, and exhaust themselves trying to force their minds into prescribed states. The dancing tree approach to meditation involves maintaining steady awareness of the roots while allowing thoughts and emotions to flow through consciousness without resistance, the branches. This doesn't mean being carried away by every mental movement, but rather observing with stable attention while allowing natural processes to unfold. The transformation in Batbaya's relationships with other monks demonstrates how flexibility can actually strengthen our connections with others. When we're rigid in our interactions, we often create unnecessary conflicts and miss opportunities for understanding and cooperation. When we can bend without breaking our integrity, we become more skillful in navigating complex social dynamics. This teaching has profound applications for how we handle life's major storms, job losses, relationship endings, health crises, and other circumstances beyond our control. The rigid approach fights against these changes, often intensifying our suffering and preventing adaptive responses. The flexible approach allows us to feel the full impact of difficulty while maintaining our capacity for wise action. Buddhist teachers often point out that the most resilient people are not those who never bend, but those who have learned to recover their upright position after being bent by life's storms. Like the dancing tree returning to its natural posture after each tempest, we can learn to bounce back from adversity with our essential nature intact, but our wisdom deepened. The practice of distinguishing between what we can and cannot control, popularized in Western psychology through Stoicism, reflects this same understanding. We waste enormous energy trying to control external circumstances while neglecting to develop our capacity for skillful response to whatever conditions actually arise. In relationships, career challenges, health issues, and countless daily frustrations, we can ask ourselves, am I being like a rigid tree that will eventually break, or like the dancing tree that moves with the storm while remaining rooted in what matters most? Tonight, as you rest in the quiet stillness, can you sense which aspects of yourself are like roots, stable, deep, and unchanging, and which aspects are like branches, capable of flowing and adapting to life's changing winds? Can you feel how this recognition might allow you to be both more flexible and more fundamentally strong? Remember the Buddha's words, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. The dancing tree teaches us that the most powerful response to life's challenges is neither rigid resistance nor passive submission, but skillful flexibility that maintains our essential nature while adapting gracefully to whatever storms may come. In the imperial gardens of ancient China, during a time when the emperor was known for his love of beauty and his patronage of the arts, there lived a young gardener named Li Wei who possessed an extraordinary gift for growing flowers. His garden plots produced the most magnificent blooms anyone had ever seen, roses that seemed to glow with inner light, chrysanthemums with petals like silk, lotus flowers that appeared to float on air rather than water. Li Wei had learned his craft from his grandfather, who had served in the imperial gardens before him, and he approached his work with the reverence and precision that comes from generations of passed-down wisdom. Every seed was planted with careful attention to soil conditions. Every plant was tended with patient devotion, and every garden bed was maintained with the kind of care that transforms mere horticulture into living art. When the emperor announced a contest to select a new chief gardener for the imperial palace, Li Wei felt both excitement and trepidation. The position was one of the highest honors a gardener could achieve, carrying with it not only prestige and material rewards, but also the opportunity to create beauty for the emperor and his court on a scale Li Wei had never imagined possible. The contest, however, would not be judged on past achievements or reputation. Instead, the emperor had devised a unique test that would reveal each contestant's true skill and character. Every aspiring gardener in the kingdom was invited to receive a special seed from the emperor's personal collection. They would have exactly 1 year to cultivate this seed and present the resulting plant to the imperial judges. On the appointed day, Li Wei joined hundreds of other gardeners from across the empire in the great courtyard of the palace. The emperor himself appeared, carrying an ornate box filled with seeds that gleamed like small jewels in the morning sunlight. These seeds, the emperor announced to the gathered crowd, have been specially selected for this contest. Each of you will receive 1 seed, and 1 seed only. You have until this same day next year to present me with the plant you have grown. The gardener who produces the most beautiful and vigorous specimen will become my chief gardener. Li Wei approached the emperor with deep reverence and received his seed, a small, dark grain that felt somehow different from any seed he had handled before. There was something unusual about its texture and weight, but he couldn't identify exactly what made it distinctive. Returning to his modest home, Li Wei immediately began preparing the finest possible conditions for his precious seed. He selected his best clay pot, filled it with the richest soil mixture he could create, and chose the optimal location in his garden where the plant would receive perfect amounts of sunlight and protection from harsh winds. With the same care he brought to all his gardening work, Li Wei planted the imperial seed and began the patient process of cultivation. He watered it with exactly the right amount of moisture, protected it from pests and extreme weather, and watched over it with the devoted attention of a parent caring for a beloved child. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Li Wei checked his pot every morning with hopeful expectation, looking for the first signs of sprouting. Other gardeners in his village began to display vigorous seedlings that were growing into impressive young plants. Some boasted of exotic flowers beginning to bud, others showed off unusual foliage that promised spectacular blooms to come. But Li Wei's pot remained empty. The dark soil surface showed no sign of emerging life, no matter how carefully he tended it. He began to worry that perhaps he had planted the seed too deep, or too shallow, or that his soil mixture was somehow inadequate. He tried adjusting the amount of water, the location of the pot, the exposure to sunlight. Nothing made any difference. As the months continued to pass, Li Wei's anxiety grew. He consulted with other gardeners, studied ancient texts about cultivation techniques, and even considered whether he might have somehow damaged the seed during planting. But no amount of research or adjustment seemed to help. His pot remained stubbornly barren. By the 6th month, Li Wei was in despair. The other gardeners in his area were displaying plants of extraordinary beauty and vigor. One had grown a flowering vine that produced blossoms in colors no one had ever seen before. Another had cultivated a small tree whose leaves seemed to shimmer with metallic highlights. A third had nurtured a flowering shrub that filled the entire neighborhood with heavenly fragrance. Li Wei's pot, despite his careful attention and devoted care, contained nothing but empty soil. As the final months of the contest period approached, Li Wei faced a terrible dilemma. He could present his empty pot to the imperial judges and face certain humiliation, admitting that despite his reputation and family tradition, he had completely failed to grow anything from the emperor's seed. Alternatively, he could secretly obtain a spectacular plant from his own garden, transplant it into the contest pot, and hope that the judges wouldn't detect his deception. The temptation to cheat was enormous. Li Wei had spent his entire life building a reputation as a skilled gardener, and this failure threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. Moreover, the other contestants would present magnificent specimens that would make his empty pot look pathetic by comparison. But every time Li Wei considered replacing his failed plant with something from his own garden, he remembered his grandfather's teachings about integrity and honesty. His grandfather had always emphasized that a gardener's true skill was measured not just by his ability to produce beautiful plants, but by his willingness to accept responsibility for both his successes and failures. After many sleepless nights of internal struggle, Li Wei made his decision. On the day of judging, he would present his empty pot to the emperor, regardless of the humiliation this might bring. The contest judging day arrived with great fanfare. Gardeners from across the empire gathered in the palace courtyard, each carrying magnificent specimens that demonstrated extraordinary horticultural achievement. The variety and beauty of the plants was breathtaking. Flowers that seemed to glow with inner light, foliage in impossible colors, fragrances that transformed the air into a garden paradise. When Li Wei's turn came to present his entry, he approached the emperor's judging platform carrying his empty pot, his face burning with shame but his resolve firm. The crowd around him gasped in surprise and began murmuring among themselves. What was this peasant thinking, presenting an empty container to the emperor? "Your Majesty," Li Wei said, his voice steady despite his embarrassment, "I have tended this seed for 1 full year with all the skill and devotion I possess. I have given it the finest soil, the most careful watering, the optimal conditions for growth. Yet despite my best efforts, nothing has grown. I can only present to you this empty pot and my sincere apology for my failure." A hush fell over the entire courtyard. The emperor studied Li Wei's face intently, then looked down at the empty pot for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent gathering. "You have not failed," the emperor said with a smile that transformed his entire expression. "You have succeeded magnificently. The seeds I distributed to all the contestants had been boiled beforehand. Not one of them was capable of growing anything at all. Every gardener except you has attempted to deceive me by presenting plants. They grew from different seeds." The emperor gestured toward all the magnificent specimens the other contestants had proudly displayed. "These beautiful plants represent impressive gardening skill, but they also represent fundamental dishonesty. You alone have shown me the most important quality. I was seeking in my chief gardener complete integrity." Li Wei stood in stunned silence as the full meaning of the emperor's words sank in. The contest had never been about growing plants at all. It had been about character, about the willingness to present truth even when truth appeared to be failure. "A gardener who will lie about small things will lie about large things," the emperor continued. "But a gardener who will present an empty pot rather than compromise his honesty is someone I can trust with the most precious treasures of my kingdom." As the emperor announced Li Wei as the winner of the contest and the new chief imperial gardener, Li Wei understood that his grandfather's teachings about integrity had prepared him for this moment in ways that all his horticultural knowledge never could. The empty pot, which had seemed like evidence of his failure, had actually been the seed of his greatest success. The Buddha taught, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth." Li Wei's empty pot reveals this profound teaching about the power of honesty and the ultimate futility of deception, even when truth appears to lead to personal disadvantage. Why do we find it so difficult to maintain integrity when honesty seems to threaten our success or reputation? Buddhist psychology identifies several deeply conditioned patterns that make deception appear attractive. First is our attachment to external validation, the way we construct our self-worth around others' opinions of our achievements. Li Wei initially felt shame about his empty pot because he feared that others would judge his worth based on his apparent failure to grow the imperial seed. Second is our confusion between temporary appearances and ultimate reality. The other gardener's magnificent plants created the illusion of success, but this success was built on a foundation of deception that would inevitably be revealed. Li Wei's empty pot appeared to represent failure, but it actually demonstrated the integrity that the emperor was truly seeking. Third is our tendency toward short-term thinking, focusing on immediate consequences rather than long-term outcomes. Cheating might have allowed Li Wei to avoid temporary embarrassment, but it would have built his future position on a lie that would eventually undermine everything he achieved. The Emperor's test represents what Buddhist teachers call skillful means, using circumstances to reveal deeper truths about character and wisdom by giving contestants seeds that couldn't grow. The Emperor created conditions where each person's fundamental honesty would be clearly revealed. Those who were primarily concerned with appearance would demonstrate their dishonesty, while those who valued truth above reputation would reveal their integrity. This story illuminates the difference between two kinds of success. External success, measured by impressive achievements and social recognition, can often be achieved through various forms of deception or manipulation. Internal success, measured by alignment between our actions and our deepest values, can only be achieved through consistent honesty and integrity. Buddhist monastic communities have long understood that character is revealed most clearly during moments of apparent failure or difficulty. When things are going well, it's easy to maintain ethical behavior. When we face potential embarrassment, financial loss, or social rejection, our true priorities become visible. The empty pot serves as a powerful metaphor for the spiritual journey itself. Many practitioners become discouraged when their meditation practice doesn't produce the dramatic experiences they expected, when their efforts to cultivate compassion don't immediately transform their relationships, or when their study of Dharma doesn't quickly eliminate their personal problems. Like Li Wei tending his barren pot with consistent care, spiritual practice sometimes requires us to continue our efforts even when we see no apparent results. The emptiness we experience may actually be the clearing away of illusions and false expectations that must occur before genuine understanding can emerge. The story also reveals the profound connection between honesty with others and honesty with ourselves. Li Wei's willingness to present his empty pot to the Emperor reflected his ability to acknowledge reality as it was, rather than as he wished it to be. This kind of self-honesty is essential for spiritual development, as it allows us to see our actual condition clearly rather than maintaining comforting self-deceptions. In Buddhist psychology, the tendency to present false appearances is seen as a form of suffering rather than simply moral failing. When we feel compelled to deceive others about our achievements, capabilities, or inner state, we create a gap between our public persona and our private reality that generates ongoing anxiety and isolation. The Emperor's recognition of Li Wei's integrity demonstrates how honesty, even when it appears disadvantageous, often attracts the respect and trust of people whose opinion truly matters. While deceptive people may achieve temporary success, they rarely gain the deep respect that comes from consistent authenticity. The contest's outcome also illustrates the Buddhist teaching that what appears to be loss is sometimes actually gain, and what appears to be gain is sometimes actually loss. The gardeners who presented beautiful but fraudulent plants gained temporary admiration, but lost the Emperor's trust and the opportunity for genuine success. In our daily lives, we face countless opportunities to choose between maintaining our integrity and achieving immediate advantage through various forms of deception. These choices may seem small, exaggerating our accomplishments on a resume, taking credit for work we didn't do, or pretending to understand something we don't, but they shape our character in profound ways. Tonight, as you reflect on the areas of your life where you might be tempted to present appearances rather than reality, can you find the courage that Li Wei demonstrated in presenting his empty pot? Can you trust that honesty, even when it feels vulnerable or disadvantageous, ultimately serves your deepest well-being? Remember the Buddha's words, "The honest person is like a bright light in the darkness." Li Wei's empty pot, seemingly a symbol of failure, actually became a beacon of integrity that illuminated his true character and guided him toward authentic success. In the remote mountains of ancient Tibet, where glacial streams carved their way through valleys untouched by human civilization, there lived a hermit monk named Tashi, who had spent 15 years in solitary retreat. His small stone hut was built beside a crystal-clear mountain river that flowed year-round, fed by eternal snows and underground springs that had never known drought. Tashi had originally come to this isolated valley seeking the deepest possible immersion in spiritual practice, far from the distractions and social complexities of monastery life. He had imagined that solitude would accelerate his spiritual development, allowing him to achieve the profound realization that seemed elusive in the company of other monks. For the first several years of his retreat, Tashi followed a rigorous schedule of meditation, study, and simple maintenance tasks that kept his hermitage functioning. He grew a small garden for vegetables, maintained his hut against the harsh mountain weather, and spent long hours in seated meditation facing the constantly flowing river. But as the years accumulated, Tashi found himself struggling with an unexpected problem. Instead of the deepening peace and wisdom he had anticipated, he experienced increasing restlessness and a subtle but persistent sense of spiritual stagnation. His meditation practice had become routine rather than transformative, and he felt as though he were going through the motions of spiritual development without actually progressing. Most troubling of all, Tashi had developed what he recognized as attachment to his solitary lifestyle and his identity as a hermit. He took pride in his ability to survive independently in the harsh mountain environment, in his disciplined daily routine, and in his freedom from the social complications that affected other monks. This pride, he knew, was a form of ego clinging that contradicted everything he was supposed to be cultivating through his practice. One morning in early spring, as Tashi sat beside the river during his daily meditation, he became aware that he was not actually watching the water flow, but was lost in familiar thoughts about his spiritual progress and frustrations. When he brought his attention back to the present moment and really looked at the river, he noticed something that struck him with sudden clarity. The river never tried to hold onto its water. Every drop that flowed past his sitting spot was immediately replaced by another drop, which was immediately replaced by another, in an endless succession of giving and receiving. The river was constantly full, yet nothing in it ever remained for more than a moment. More significantly, Tashi realized that the river's generosity was completely natural and effortless. It wasn't trying to be generous or making any decision about sharing its water. The flowing was simply its nature, as automatic and unconsidered as breathing. As Tashi contemplated this observation over the following days, he began to see parallels between the river's flow and aspects of spiritual life he had been struggling to understand. The river received water constantly from countless sources, melting snow, underground springs, tributary streams, even rainwater, yet it never became possessive about what it received. Everything flowed through it without obstruction. Similarly, the river gave constantly to everything downstream: animals that came to drink, plants along its banks that needed moisture, eventually the great lakes and oceans that depended on its contribution. Yet this constant giving never diminished the river. In fact, the more it gave away, the more room it created to receive new water from its sources. Tashi realized that his spiritual stagnation might be connected to his approach to practice and understanding. Like someone trying to dam a river, he had been attempting to hold on to and accumulate his spiritual experiences, insights, and progress. He meditated with the intention of gaining and keeping states of peace and clarity. He studied texts hoping to gather and possess wisdom. He practiced with the goal of achieving and maintaining enlightenment. But the river's teaching suggested a completely different approach, one of constant receiving and giving, with no attempt to hold on to or accumulate anything permanently. Inspired by this realization, Tashi began to experiment with bringing the river's approach to his daily spiritual practice. During meditation, instead of trying to achieve and maintain particular states of consciousness, he allowed his awareness to flow naturally, receiving whatever arose in his mind without judgment and letting it pass without clinging. When insights or peaceful moments arose during his sitting practice, instead of trying to hold on to them or analyze them, Tashi practiced allowing them to flow through his awareness like water flowing through the riverbank. He discovered that this non-grasping approach actually allowed deeper states of peace and clarity to emerge naturally, without the effort and tension that had characterized his earlier attempts to achieve enlightenment. More challengingly, Tashi began to reconsider his entire approach to the hermit lifestyle. He realized that his solitary retreat, while valuable in many ways, had become another form of spiritual materialism, an attempt to accumulate enlightenment through isolation, rather than allowing wisdom to flow naturally through engagement with life. The river's constant interaction with its environment, receiving from sources above, giving to destinations below, supporting life along its banks suggested that true spiritual development might require more dynamic engagement rather than the static accumulation of solitary insights. This recognition prompted Tashi to make a decision that surprised him with its clarity and rightness. After 15 years of hermit life, he would return to active engagement with the world, not abandoning his spiritual development but allowing it to flow more naturally through service and relationship with others. But first, Tashi spent several months preparing for this transition by developing what he came to think of as river practices, ways of approaching daily activities with the same non-possessive flow that characterized the mountain stream. When preparing his simple meals, instead of eating mechanically while thinking about other matters, Tashi practiced receiving the nourishment gratefully and allowing the experience of taste and satisfaction to flow through him without trying to extend or repeat it. When maintaining his hermitage, instead of working with grudging obligation or prideful efficiency, he approached each task as an opportunity to give his energy freely, like the river giving its water, without concern for recognition or permanent results. Most importantly, when difficult emotions or challenging thoughts arose, instead of fighting against them or trying to transcend them through spiritual techniques, Tashi practiced allowing them to move through his awareness like clouds reflected in the river's surface, present and acknowledged, but not disturbed or disturbing. By the time Tashi was ready to leave his mountain retreat, his entire approach to spiritual life had been transformed by the river's teaching. Instead of seeking to achieve enlightenment as a permanent possession, he understood awakening as a dynamic process of constant flowing between receiving and giving, being filled and emptying, gaining understanding and offering service. On his final morning beside the mountain river, Tashi sat in meditation one last time at the spot where he had received this profound teaching. As he watched the eternal flow of clear water moving past his position toward unknown destinations, he felt deep gratitude for the years of solitude that had prepared him to receive this lesson, and for the flowing wisdom that would now guide him back into the world. "Thank you," he whispered to the river, though he knew that his gratitude, like everything else, was already flowing downstream to become part of the great circulation of giving and receiving that connected all life. As Tashi began his journey back to the valley monasteries, he carried with him not a collection of spiritual achievements, but an understanding of how to live like a river, constantly receiving life's gifts with gratitude and constantly offering his own gifts in return, never holding back and never running dry. The Buddha taught, giving is the foundation of all good qualities. Tashi's river meditation reveals the profound truth that spiritual development flows most naturally when we approach it like a river, constantly receiving and giving, never trying to possess or accumulate what moves through our experience. Why do we so often approach spiritual practice with what Toshi recognized as a damning mentality, trying to hold on to and accumulate insights, experiences, and progress? Buddhist psychology identifies several patterns that create this possessive approach to inner development. First is our deeply conditioned scarcity thinking, the assumption that spiritual resources like peace, wisdom, and compassion are limited quantities that must be hoarded to ensure our continued access to them. Second is our misunderstanding of what constitutes spiritual progress. Western culture particularly tends to approach spirituality like any other skill or achievement, through effort, accumulation, and measurable advancement. This creates what Buddhist teachers call spiritual materialism, treating awakening as another form of possession rather than as a dynamic process of open engagement with life. Third is our fear of emptiness, which makes us reluctant to let go of spiritual experiences once we've tasted them. The peaceful states that arise during meditation, the insights that emerge during study, the sense of connection we feel during service. We naturally want to hold on to these experiences rather than allowing them to flow through us like water through a riverbank. The river's teaching demonstrates what Taoists call wu-wei action, that flows in harmony with natural principles rather than against them, just as rivers don't need to effort to flow downstream. Genuine spiritual development happens most naturally when we stop trying to force particular outcomes and instead create conditions where awakening can emerge organically. The river's simultaneous receiving and giving illustrates a fundamental principle of Buddhist economics, that true wealth comes not from accumulation but from circulation. When we hold tightly to our resources, whether material or spiritual, we actually impoverish ourselves by cutting off the flow that would naturally replenish what we share. Buddhist monasteries have long recognized this principle through their emphasis on dana generosity as a foundation practice. Monks receive their material needs through the generosity of the people, then offer spiritual teachings and services in return. This creates a circulation of giving that enriches everyone involved while ensuring that no one becomes possessive about what they provide or receive. The river metaphor also illuminates the nature of mindfulness practice itself. Instead of trying to control or manipulate our experience during meditation, we learn to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations flowing through awareness like water flowing past a riverbank, present to everything, attached to nothing. Toshi's recognition that his hermit lifestyle had become another form of spiritual materialism reflects a common pattern in spiritual communities. People often use meditation practices, retreat experiences, or even service activities as ways of building spiritual identity rather than dissolving the ego clinging that creates suffering in the first place. The river's constant interaction with its environment, receiving from sources above, supporting life along its banks, contributing to larger bodies of water, suggests that authentic spiritual development requires dynamic engagement rather than static accumulation. Like the river that would stagnate if it stopped flowing, spiritual practice becomes lifeless when it's separated from active participation in life. This doesn't mean that periods of solitude and intensive practice aren't valuable. Toshi's 15 years of retreat provided essential preparation for receiving the river's teaching. but it suggests that the ultimate purpose of such intensive practice is to develop our capacity for flowing engagement with whatever life presents, not to achieve some permanent state of transcendence. The river's teaching applies powerfully to how we approach difficult emotions and challenging circumstances. Instead of trying to eliminate anxiety, anger, or sadness through spiritual techniques, we can learn to allow these experiences to move through our awareness without resistance or grasping. This doesn't mean being passive about problems that require action, but rather responding from a place of flowing presence rather than stuck reactivity. In relationships, the river principle suggests approaching others with the same non-possessive generosity that characterizes flowing water. We can offer our attention, care, and support freely while allowing others the space to receive or not receive our gifts according to their own capacity and inclination. The practice of river gratitude that Tashi developed involves recognizing how everything we experience, pleasant and unpleasant, easy and challenging, contributes to our development in ways we may not immediately understand. Like the river receiving water from countless sources, we can learn to receive life's experiences with appreciation for how they contribute to our growth and our capacity to serve others. Tonight, as you rest in the flowing present moment, can you sense the areas of your life where you might be trying to dam the natural flow of giving and receiving? Can you experiment with allowing your spiritual insights, peaceful moments, and life experiences to move through you like water through a riverbed, fully received, deeply appreciated, and freely shared? Remember the Buddha's words, "In giving, we receive. In forgiving, we are forgiven. In dying to self, we are born to eternal life." Like Tashi's mountain river, our deepest fulfillment comes not from holding on to what we've gained, but from allowing life to flow through us with constant generosity and gratitude. In the high peaks of the Himalayas, where the air is thin and sacred mountains pierce the sky like prayers made manifest, there lived a young woman named Pema, who had spent her entire adult life seeking enlightenment. From the age of 16, she had dedicated herself to spiritual practice with an intensity that amazed even the most devoted monks and nuns in her region. Pema had studied with renowned teachers throughout Tibet, Nepal, and India. She had memorized vast collections of sacred texts, completed numerous rigorous retreats, and developed exceptional skill in various forms of meditation. Her reputation as a sincere and accomplished practitioner had spread throughout the mountain communities, and many people sought her guidance on spiritual matters. Yet despite all her achievements and recognition, Pema felt that something essential remained elusive: the profound awakening that all the texts described, the permanent peace that her teachers embodied, the complete freedom from suffering that Buddhist practice promised. These seemed to remain tantalizingly beyond her reach. When Pema learned about a legendary mountain hermit named Oni Dorma, who was said to have achieved the highest levels of realization after decades of solitary practice on one of the most remote and sacred peaks in the region, she knew she had to seek out this teacher. Perhaps Ani Dorma possessed the final key that would unlock the enlightenment Pema had been pursuing for so many years. The journey to reach Ani Dorma's hermitage was extraordinarily difficult. Pema had to travel for weeks through treacherous mountain passes, cross raging rivers on narrow log bridges, and navigate trails that were little more than scratches on vertical cliff faces. The thin air made every step laborious, and the weather could change from bright sunshine to life-threatening storms within minutes. But Pema's determination carried her forward. She had left her comfortable monastery, given away most of her possessions, and committed herself completely to this pilgrimage. She was prepared to stay with Ani Dharma for as long as necessary to receive the transmission of ultimate wisdom. When Pema finally reached the hermitage, a small stone hut perched impossibly on a narrow ledge. High above the tree line, she was surprised by the simplicity of what she found. The dwelling was barely large enough for one person, with no decorations, no religious artifacts, nothing to indicate that this was the home of one of the most accomplished spiritual masters in the Himalayas. Anidharma herself was equally surprising. Instead of the radiant, otherworldly presence Pema had expected, she found a woman who appeared quite ordinary, weathered by years of mountain living, dressed in simple robes that had been patched many times. "I have come seeking the ultimate teaching," Pema announced after offering the traditional prostrations and presenting gifts she had carried up the mountain. "I have studied with many masters and practiced intensively for 15 years, but I have not yet achieved the complete awakening that the Dharma promises. Please share with me the secret of enlightenment." Anidharma listened to Pema's request with gentle attention, then smiled in a way that was both kind and mysterious. "I understand your seeking," she said, "but before I can offer you any teaching, you must first help me with a task that I have been unable to complete alone." Pema eagerly agreed, expecting that she would be asked to assist with some advanced spiritual practice or esoteric ritual that required two people to perform properly. "I need to carry water from the spring to my hut," Anidharma said simply. "The spring is about a quarter-mile down the mountain path. My old wooden bucket has developed cracks and leaks badly, so I need someone to help me transport enough water for several days." Pema was somewhat disappointed by the mundane nature of this task, but she dutifully followed Anidharma down the rocky path to where a clear spring emerged from the mountainside. The water was pure and cold, fed by snowmelt and underground sources that had been flowing for countless centuries. As they filled containers with the precious water, Pema found herself thinking impatiently about the profound teachings she hoped to receive once this chore was completed. She had traveled for weeks and endured tremendous hardships to reach this remote hermitage, and now she was spending her time on simple water carrying when she could be receiving transmissions of ultimate wisdom. The work took several hours, as they had to make multiple trips up and down the steep path to transport sufficient water to the hermitage. Pema's muscles ached from the exertion at high altitude, and she found herself growing increasingly frustrated with what seemed like a waste of precious time. When the water-carrying task was finally completed, Pema approached Anidharma with renewed expectation. "Respected teacher," she said, "now that I have helped you with this necessary work, may we begin the real teachings. I am prepared to receive whatever profound instructions you wish to share." Anidharma looked at Pema with gentle eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding. "My dear child," she said, "the teaching has already been given. You have already received everything you came here to find." Pema stared at her in confusion. "I don't understand, Anila. We have only carried water together. When will you share the secret of enlightenment?" "Tell me," Anidharma said, settling onto a flat stone outside her hut. "What were you thinking about while we carried the water?" Pema considered the question carefully. "I was thinking about how this was a necessary task that we needed to complete before we could begin the real spiritual work. I was also thinking about the teachings I hoped to receive, and about my long journey to reach this place, and about how much I wanted to finally achieve the awakening that has been eluding me for so many years." "Ah," said Anidharma with a knowing nod. "And during all this thinking about spiritual achievement and future enlightenment, what did you miss?" "I'm not sure what you mean." You missed the miracle of the spring water, so pure and clear that it seems to capture the essence of the mountain itself. You missed the extraordinary beauty of the path we walked together, with views across valleys that few human beings have ever seen. You missed the simple satisfaction of useful work done in good company. You missed the opportunity to experience the enlightenment you've been seeking, which was present in every step we took together. Pema felt a wave of confusion and frustration, but that was just ordinary activity, carrying water, walking on a path, doing physical work. How can these mundane tasks be related to enlightenment? Anidolma smiled with infinite patience. My dear seeker, this is precisely the misunderstanding that has kept you searching for 15 years. You have been looking for enlightenment as something extraordinary, something different from your ordinary experience. But enlightenment is not found by escaping the present moment. It is found by fully inhabiting it. She gestured toward the vast mountain landscape surrounding them. You have traveled across the world seeking awakening in special places, with special teachers, through special practices. But awakening is not a special state that exists somewhere else. It is the natural condition of awareness when it is fully present to what is actually here. Over the following days, as Pema remained at the hermitage trying to understand Anidolma's teaching, the old hermit continued to demonstrate this principle through the most ordinary activities. When they prepared simple meals together, Anidolma brought complete attention to every aspect of the process, washing vegetables, tending the fire, measuring portions with the same quality of presence that Pema had seen masters bring to formal meditation. When they swept the small courtyard around the hut, Anidolma moved with such fluid awareness that the simple act of removing debris became a form of moving meditation. When they sat quietly watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the hermit's stillness was so complete that Pema could feel the profound peace that arises when the mind stops seeking and simply receives what is offered. But surely, Pema protested one evening as they shared tea by the light of a butter lamp, there must be more to enlightenment than just paying attention to ordinary activities. What about the profound realizations that the texts describe? What about the elimination of suffering? What about the direct perception of emptiness and interdependence? All of these are present, Anidolma replied, but not as special experiences that you achieve through seeking. They are revealed when you stop overlaying your present experience with concepts about what should be happening instead. She held up her simple clay tea bowl. This cup contains the entire Dharma, not as a concept or philosophy, but as immediate reality. The clay that forms it came from the earth of this mountain, shaped by countless causes and conditions stretching back through geological time. The tea within it connects us to the plants that grew it, the rain that nourished them, the hands that harvested and prepared the leaves. Anidolma paused to take a sip, her attention completely absorbed in the simple act of drinking. When you are fully present with this cup of tea, not thinking about tea, not analyzing the experience, not comparing it to other cups of tea you have enjoyed, then the interdependence of all phenomena is not a theory but a lived reality. The emptiness of inherent existence is not a philosophical position but a direct perception. As the days passed, Pema began to experiment with bringing the quality of attention she observed in Anidolma to her own activities. Instead of treating daily tasks as obstacles to real spiritual practice, she tried to engage with them as opportunities for presence and awareness. When she helped with cooking, instead of letting her mind wander to spiritual concepts or future plans, she practiced attending completely to the textures, aromas, and colors of the food she was preparing. When she walked the mountain paths, instead of reviewing past teachings or anticipating future insights, she practiced feeling her feet contacting the earth with each step. Most challenging of all, when she sat in formal meditation, instead of trying to achieve special states of consciousness or profound realizations, Pema practiced simply being aware of whatever was actually present in her experience: breath, body sensations, sounds, thoughts, without preference or agenda. Gradually, something began to shift in Pema's understanding. The extraordinary she had been seeking was not absent from her ordinary experience. It was hidden within it, obscured by her constant mental commentary about what should be happening instead of what actually was happening. One morning, as Pema was sitting in meditation beside the hermitage, watching the sun rise over the surrounding peaks, she found herself completely absorbed in the simple miracle of light returning to the world. There was no seeker, no sought, no sense of trying to achieve anything, only the immediate reality of awareness and phenomena arising, together in perfect wholeness. The experience lasted only a few moments before her analytical mind returned with excitement about this breakthrough. But in those moments, Pema understood what Annie Dolma had been pointing toward. Enlightenment was not a destination to reach, but the natural state of awareness when it stopped seeking something other than what was already present. When Pema shared this realization with Annie Dolma, the old hermit nodded with gentle satisfaction. "Now you begin to understand why I never left this mountain to seek teachings elsewhere. Everything I needed to discover was already here, waiting to be recognized. But what about all the years I spent studying with different teachers? All the practices I learned, all the texts I memorized?" Pema asked. "They served their purpose perfectly," Annie Dolma replied. "Like a finger pointing at the moon, they directed your attention toward what you were seeking. But now that you have glimpsed the moon directly, you don't need to keep staring at the finger." She gestured toward the simple hermitage that had been Pema's destination after so many years of seeking. "You have climbed this mountain not because enlightenment lives at the top, but because the journey of seeking eventually exhausts itself and reveals what was, never absent from any moment of the climb." After spending several weeks at the hermitage, Pema prepared to return to the valleys below. But her departure was very different from her arrival. Instead of carrying disappointment about not receiving the extraordinary teachings she had expected, she carried the understanding that every step of her return journey would offer opportunities to practice the presence she had discovered on the mountain. "Will you continue living as a hermit?" Pema asked Annie Dolma on her final morning at the retreat. The old woman smiled. "I have never been a hermit," she replied. "I live in constant communion with the earth, sky, weather, seasons, plants, and animals of this place. My solitude is actually the deepest form of relationship, intimate connection with life itself, without the filter of mental commentary that usually separates us from direct experience." As Pema began her descent from the sacred mountain, she understood that her years of seeking had brought her full circle. She was returning to the same world she had left, but with eyes that could finally see the enlightenment that had been present in every moment of her journey, waiting only for her restless seeking to exhaust itself and reveal the extraordinary nature of ordinary awareness. The mountain's secret was not hidden at its peak, but revealed in the simple recognition that the seeker and the sought had never been separate, that the path and the destination were one, and that the enlightenment she had pursued across the world had been the very awareness with which she had been seeking it. The Buddha taught, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. Circular Journey reveals the profound truth that what we seek through spiritual practice is not absent from our current experience, but hidden by our very seeking for it elsewhere. Why do we embark on elaborate spiritual quests when awakening is available in every present moment? Buddhist psychology identifies several patterns that create this paradox of seeking. First is our conditioning toward goal-oriented thinking, which makes us approach enlightenment as a destination to reach rather than a recognition of what is already present. Like Pema climbing the mountain to find what was available at every step of the journey, we often exhaust ourselves pursuing what we already possess. Second is our tendency to idealize distant teachers and exotic practices while overlooking the wisdom available in our immediate circumstances. The grass appears greener in far-off ashrams and retreat centers, but awakening requires no special location or conditions, only the willingness to be fully present with whatever life is offering right now. Third is our misunderstanding of what constitutes spiritual versus ordinary experience. We create artificial hierarchies that place meditation above dishwashing, retreat time above family responsibilities, or profound insights above simple attention to daily tasks. But as Ani Dolma demonstrated, enlightenment is not found by transcending ordinary life, but by fully engaging with it. The water-carrying teaching that Pema initially missed illustrates how presence transforms even the most mundane activities into opportunities for awakening. When we bring complete attention to simple tasks, feeling the weight of the water, sensing our feet on the path, appreciating the necessity of the work, these moments become gateways to the same awareness that formal meditation cultivates. Buddhist monasteries have long understood this principle through their emphasis on work, practice, treating, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and maintenance activities as forms of meditation rather than obstacles to spiritual development. The Zen tradition particularly emphasizes that enlightenment must be integrated into daily activity, not confined to formal sitting periods. The mountain hermit's lifestyle represents not escape from life, but deeper intimacy with it. Ani Dolma's solitude allowed her to develop such sensitivity to present moment experience that she could find profound teaching in a cup of tea, a sunset, or the simple task of carrying water. Her practice was not about achieving special states, but about removing the mental barriers that prevented natural awareness from recognizing its own complete nature. Pema's transformation from seeking to finding illustrates what Buddhist teachers call the pathless path, the recognition that spiritual development is not about adding something to our experience, but about removing the obstacles that prevent us from recognizing what is already whole and complete. This doesn't invalidate the value of formal spiritual training. Pema's years of study and practice were necessary preparation for receiving Ani Dolma's simple pointing, like scaffolding that supports a building under construction. Spiritual practices and teachings serve their purpose until the moment of recognition occurs, after which they become unnecessary supports rather than essential structures. The circular nature of Pema's journey reflects a common pattern in authentic spiritual development. We often need to exhaust our seeking completely before we can settle into simple being. The restless mind that drives us to travel great distances in search of awakening must tire itself out before it can recognize that it was carrying what it sought throughout the entire journey. The teaching about the teacup containing the entire Dharma points to the Buddhist understanding that enlightenment involves perceiving the interconnected nature of all phenomena, not as an intellectual concept, but as immediate reality. When we are truly present with any single experience, a cup of tea, a breath, a footstep, the whole universe reveals itself within that moment. In contemporary life, we often create artificial divisions between spiritual time and ordinary time, sacred activities and mundane activities, enlightened awareness and everyday consciousness. But Oni Dalma's teaching suggests that these divisions exist only in our thinking, not in reality itself. The practice of ordinary enlightenment involves bringing the same quality of attention to brushing teeth, washing dishes, or having conversations that we might bring to formal meditation. This doesn't require special effort or techniques, only the willingness to be fully present instead of mentally somewhere else. Tonight, as you rest in the simplicity of this moment, can you sense how the awareness that is reading these words is the same awareness that spiritual seekers travel great distances to discover? Can you feel how the peace you seek through elaborate practices is available right now in the simple recognition of your own present moment consciousness? Remember the Buddha's words, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." Like Pema discovering that her mountain pilgrimage had been a circle that brought her home to herself. We can recognize that the enlightenment we pursue is the very awareness with which we are pursuing it, closer than our own breath and more intimate than our heartbeat. As our journey through these ancient tales of wisdom draws to a gentle close, take a moment to feel the ground beneath you, the air around you, and the natural rhythm of your breathing. For the past hours, you have traveled alongside Buddhist monks through gardens of patience, halls of silence, and mountains of awakening, collecting not concepts to remember, but invitations to experience life more fully. Each story we have shared contains a seed of understanding that doesn't need to be grasped or analyzed, but simply allowed to rest in the fertile stillness of your awareness. Master Tenzin's garden teaches us that inner peace grows naturally when tended with patience. The silent bell reminds us that the deepest communication happens beyond words. Brother Tenzin learned that light multiplies when shared, never diminishing the giver. The worried merchant discovered how to travel lightly through life, carrying only what serves the present journey. The butterfly's emergence showed us that transformation requires trusting the process rather than forcing the outcome. Norbu's simple wisdom revealed that enlightenment often appears foolish to the clever mind but touches the heart directly. The broken bridge taught us that obstacles often redirect us toward gifts we never could have planned. The dancing tree demonstrated that true strength lies not in rigidity but in flowing with life's changing conditions. The empty pot revealed that integrity is more valuable than any achievement built on deception. Like the mountain river that flows constantly between receiving and giving, authentic spiritual life moves in dynamic balance rather than static accumulation. And like the pilgrim who traveled to a distant mountain only to discover that what she sought was present in every step of her journey, we can recognize that the peace we long for is already here, waiting only for our restless seeking to settle into simple presence. The Buddha taught, in the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. As you prepare to rest now, let these words guide you into the natural letting go that happens each night, releasing the day's concerns, the mind's endless planning, and the heart's accumulated tensions. Allow your body to become heavy against whatever supports it now. Feel your breathing naturally slowing and deepening as your nervous system recognizes the safety of this moment. Notice how thoughts that seemed urgent during the day lose their grip as you settle into the present reality of rest and restoration. The Buddhist monks whose wisdom we have shared understood that sleep is not the enemy of awakening, but one of its most natural expressions. In dreams and deep rest, the controlling mind releases its grip, allowing consciousness to move in the same flowing, non-attached way that characterizes enlightened awareness. So as you drift toward sleep, carry with you not the burden of remembering these teachings, but the gentle understanding that wisdom is not something you possess, but something you embody through the quality of presence you bring to each moment. The garden of your inner life will continue to grow even as you rest, tended by the same natural intelligence that grows flowers without effort and moves the stars without struggle. May you rest deeply, knowing that you are held by the same vast awareness that has supported countless seekers throughout history. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams be gentle. May you awaken refreshed, carrying the timeless wisdom of these ancient teachings not as concepts in your mind, but as natural compassion in your heart. The Buddha's final words were, "Work out your salvation with diligence." But tonight, let diligence take the form of complete surrender to rest, trusting that the deepest spiritual work often happens when we stop trying and simply allow life to move through us with its own perfect wisdom. Sleep well, dear traveler. The path continues even in your rest, and awakening is as close as your next breath, your next moment of simple presence, your next opportunity to meet life with the open heart of a Buddhist monk who has learned to find the sacred in the most ordinary moments. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings awaken to the light that is their true nature. Rest now in the great silence from which all wisdom arises and to which all seeking returns. The journey is complete, yet always beginning, like the eternal circle of breath that carries us gently into sleep and back to awakening, again and again in the endless dance of consciousness discovering itself.